Sometime around 1346, the Black Death first made its presence known on the borders of what most of us think of as the Western world, on the northwest shores of the Caspian Sea. From there, it made a hesitant push northward into what we think of today as Russia, but any more progress in that direction stalled by 1348. Instead, the plague picked up a serious head of steam moving south and west in a generally clockwise direction, devastating most of Italy, France, Spain, England, and Ireland. You'll recall that Barcelona was particularly hard hit, as was Valencia and Roussillon. The Kingdom of Granada, the last of the major Muslim territories on the Iberian Peninsula, also suffered major losses, as did Lisbon, in what is today Portugal. Ireland was actually struck around the same time as England in 1348, but the plague didn't make it to Scotland until 1350, which is clear evidence that it was through port cities that traded with the continent that the plague first made it across the English Channel. At this time, Scotland was much more Scandinavian in its worldview and trading relationships. It was looking north instead of west, which is why both it and Sweden and Norway get infected around the same time. The plague reached Sweden by 1349 and then continued the loop in 1350 by pushing further into Scandinavia and from there south through the Baltic states into what we think of as Germany. At this time, some of these territories, and those adjacent, including the modern-day Netherlands, Switzerland, the Czech Republic, and the territory known as Bohemia, were considered part of the entity known as the Holy Roman Empire, which, as most of you know, was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. More or less an artificial construct, especially as we move from the medieval into the modern world. The Holy Roman Empire was a loose confederation of territories, and within and adjacent to its borders were numerous free and independent city-states. But we can use the term Holy Roman Empire as a kind of shorthand to describe this region of Europe in the 14th century. Or, as one of my students once put it, it's a region that's mostly German-ish. At the same time that the Black Death was moving from the north southward into the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, another wave was moving overland more slowly in a northerly direction to these same locales from the Italian peninsula. Around 1350, these waves crashed into each other. Or, in the words of the great scholar Ole Benedictov, these territories were caught in a pincer of disease coming from multiple directions. The spread of infection was made all the worse by the fact that this territory has a huge system of navigable rivers and port cities, and as we know by now, where do rats like to hang out? On the waterfront. And the goods that were being transported along these networks were of the sort that fleas might hang out in for some time. Also, back in the 13th century, trade along these routes had been made easier and tariffs, etc., had been standardized by the formation of what would become known as the Hanseatic League, which would become a confederation of city-states that worked together to secure their common economic interests. Alas, this spirit of cooperation would often prove to be fatal, as it allowed for easier movement of goods and people among infected locales, especially along the rivers Rhine, Elbe, Vistula, Oder, and other waterways and their tributaries. Compared to other European regions, especially Italy, France, and England, texts discussing the Black Death in German and its dialects tend to be sparse and also rather succinct in their discussions of what was happening. There is no German equivalent of Boccaccio describing the horrors that the great pestilence wrought on the population. At the same time, however, as far as we can tell, the devastating impact was pretty much the same as throughout the rest of the medieval world. Mortality rates of around 50%, with all three forms of plague appearing. And then, the Black Death turned east, pushing into Poland in 1351, hitting Russian territories from Kiev in the south and up the Dnieper River in 1352, and fully devastated Moscow by 1353, ending up almost back where it began. For a long time, historians were puzzled as to why the plague had to take such a long route to get to Russia. Russian chroniclers were fully aware of the epidemic raging to the south of them as early as 1348 or 1349, but they didn't really feel its impact until 1353. That's a long time to be holding your breath in anticipation of some horror that might rain down upon you at any moment. The best scholars can figure is that there was this lag of plague making its way into Russia via a northwest overland route, because the Russian steppe was thinly populated, and the presence of the dreaded Mongol Golden Horde to the south meant that no one was really inclined to move in that direction. And we can say that in 1353, the first wave of the plague had fully crested and burned itself out, if you'll allow me to mix some metaphors here. While the plague would return again and again to the European world at least once or twice a generation, from 1353 onward, its virulence was greatly diminished. Never again would the medieval world see such a devastating event in such a short space of time. Let's pause for a moment and think about this. By our best estimates, the medieval world had a population of around 150 million in 1346. 7 years later, the population had dropped to around 70 to 75 million, and for many communities or countries, there would be no serious demographic recovery until well into the 15th century. And in some cases, it was well into the 17th century before population numbers had fully recovered. And so, I want to spend some time here on the particular and unique aspects of the responses to this last gasp of the Black Death as it completed its first deadly pass through the medieval world. One thing that we have to remember is that by this point, most people were well aware that the plague was coming. It was just a matter of when, not if, the great pestilence showed up on your doorstep. As we'll discuss in great detail in several later lectures, this knowledge led some desperate people to take preemptive action and to be willing to believe all kinds of rumor and conspiracy theories. The most famous and infamous was the popular belief that the Jews were causing the illness by poisoning the wells of various towns. In a series of horrifying atrocities that both recall the pilgrims of the Crusades when they marched through the Rhineland 2 centuries previously, and which also anticipate the horrors of the 20th century Holocaust, several communities, like Strasbourg and Bern, executed or expelled a large portion of their Jewish community before the plague had even reached their town. This particular brand of anti-Semitism didn't tend to recur, however, since even though all their Jews were exiled or dead, these towns still were some of the hardest hit by the plague, and there was no one left to serve as a scapegoat when the Great Mortality made its appearance. In the previous lecture, I talked a bit about how the Scandinavian countries were differently affected than most of the rest of Europe because they were not fully feudal or manorialized. More people in these countries were free landholders, and there wasn't the same sort of intensely hierarchical system of servitude and protection, what we might call vassalage, that was so predominant in a place like England and France. And in today's lecture, we're going to move further east and talk about Russia and parts of Poland, which had a social infrastructure that was slightly different from that of both Scandinavia and the non-Scandinavian parts of Western Europe. In what we think of today as Russia, the effects of the Black Death at first seem to be similar to what we find in the European West. The people hardest hit were the aristocracy, who might have all kinds of land, but a shortage of bodies to work it. The nobility or great landowners were, for the most part, considered subject to a central ruling elite in Moscow, and in this very centralized structure, Russian social order was somewhat like what we saw in feudal England, with its hierarchical structure leading back to the king. But what's different here is how those affected in Russia looked to Moscow for help. whereas the towns and villages in most of England, and indeed places like Florence, Italy, sought to cope with their community's problems on their own. So in Russia, we have a familiar pattern start to play out. Landowners needed more bodies to work their farmland after the first wave of plague had passed, and suddenly, cash wages went up because laborers could pick and choose when and where they would work. When the population began to recover, however, the Russian aristocracy found itself in a bind. Economically, they were now in a pattern of having to pay much higher wages in order to have their land plowed and harvested, and once the numbers of their own class finally began to increase again, after the first wave of the plague had passed, there simply wasn't as much in the way of resources as the Russian noblemen might expect or want. This in turn led members of the aristocracy to start flocking to Moscow in an attempt to find power, status, and money there. So Moscow and the Kremlin princes found themselves under considerable pressure from the aristocracy who were seeking security. While Moscow was the center of power in Russia, in the mid-1350s and the decades after, it was not quite powerful enough to cope successfully with the extreme social and economic pressures the Black Death brought with it. Scholar Gustav Aleph argues that, quote, had the Great Plagues of the 14th century not arrested the growth of the population when Moscow was small and more vulnerable to pressure than it would become a century later, and when the powers of the Kremlin princes were far weaker, no doubt the history of the Russian Northeast would have turned out far different, end quote. Meanwhile, monastic houses in many parts of Russia started to gobble up all this unclaimed land that was suddenly available because the owner and all his heirs were dead or had fled to Moscow. These vacant lands that got snapped up and consolidated became known as pustoshi. As these monasteries began to acquire more and more land, they also became very important economic and trading centers, and soon they began to pose real competition and a problem for independent merchants and traders who had survived the plague. Many of these monastic estates pushed for and received tax-free status within certain zones, which put them at an economic advantage and the independent tradesmen at a serious disadvantage. As the Russian population began to recover in the early 15th century, it looked for a time as if the powers of the monastic states might start to be checked a bit, and the countryside would return to more of a balanced state, something like it had been before the plague. But then, when later waves of plague struck in the 15th century, this produced a famine, which in turn created more population loss, which then cemented the powers of the monastic estates. As scholar Lawrence Langer puts it, quote, in effect, the Black Death forced the Russian princes to rely increasingly upon the monasteries to develop rural agriculture and manufacture. Plague and famine gave form and direction to the growth of monastic estates and to the political tensions that later occurred between the monasteries and Russia's rulers. What was really devastating for the Russian countryside and urban centers is that prior to the arrival of the Black Death, they had had to deal with a series of invasions by the Mongols. From 1237 to 1240, Mongol armies had swept out of the east and established their rule over several Russian territories. They completely devastated the Principality of Kiev, and in the aftermath of this invasion, most of the other Russian principalities had become subject territories of the Golden Horde, having to pay taxes, supply able-bodied men for military service, and so on. A few territories in the West had elected to make themselves subject to the newly developed state of Lithuania, and thus escaped the yoke of Mongol rule. But then something happened to turn the attention of the Mongols away from Russia and focus it on the south. In 1313, a new Khan assumed the throne of the Mongols, and this man, Uzbeg, was a recent convert to Islam. He worked hard to get the elite of the Mongol horde to join him in practicing his religion, and he was much occupied for most of his reign with putting down rebellions and dealing with assassination attempts. But in the end, he was successful, and when Yanibeg Khan came to the throne in 1342, Islam was the official state religion of the Mongols. Now, Yanibeg's name might sound vaguely familiar to you from one of our earliest lectures. That's because he, during his reign, was preoccupied with getting Christian merchants out of the territories near the Black Sea that were controlled by the Mongols. Who were these Christian merchants? Why, most of them were Italian. They were represented in particular by the Genoese, who had long established trading posts and fortifications along the Black Sea and in the Crimea, including, you guessed it, the infamous city of Kaffa. You'll probably recall that in 1343, the Genoese merchants fled from their trading center of Tana to the fortified city of Kaffa, and Yanibeg and his forces then laid siege to it. During that siege, the plague found its way into the Mongol ranks, and then, in 1346, it supposedly found its way into the city of Kaffa when Yanibeg launched the corpses of plague victims into the city via trebuchet. The Genoese fled back to Genoa, stopping off in the port of Messina in Sicily on the way. And the rest, as they say, is history. The great irony here is that it was the appearance of the Black Death among the Mongols way back in 1346 that finally gave Russia's political and social systems some breathing room and a chance to recover from over a century of Mongol rule. By 1353, a sense of normalcy and a stable population with a reliable supply of craftsmen and laborers was just starting to get itself back in place in most of Russia. But then, along came the Black Death, again the very thing that had oh so briefly allowed for some recovery and growth. The reappearance of the plague in Russia dealt the struggling labor, economic, and political systems another serious blow that would have repercussions for centuries. Now, as we've seen in our discussions of communities in Western Europe, and as we'll see in some detail later, the sudden lack of labor meant that those who did survive were usually better off, as they were able to command much higher wages than they had previously. In part, they were able to manage this because prior to the arrival of the Black Death, most craftsmen and tradespeople were part of a firmly established guild system that had long existed to protect their interests. Remember how the Ciompi Guild took over the rule of the city-state of Florence on the Italian peninsula in the wake of the plague? Well, in Russia, there was no established guild system, but instead, in a rather spotty, non-institutionalized fashion, a slave system. So desperate were towns and monastic communities for skilled artisans that they actually tightened their grip and used their power and influence to more or less enslave the workers they needed to keep their societies running. And given that the monasteries were the ones snapping up all the free land that was available after this demographic plunge, it's not a surprise, really, that in post-plague Russia, the church became one of the biggest de facto slaveholding entities. Now, I say de facto because by church law, they were not actually officially permitted to own slaves, but they needed blacksmiths, goldsmiths, iconographers, silver workers, and basic agricultural laborers. So they purchased craftsmen from the political entities that owned them, officially granted them their personal freedom, but then they quote-unquote held them in service, even though they had officially liberated them, which is kind of a polite way of saying they made them indentured servants of a sort. The effects of this system would be felt well into the modern day, as eventually people began to see the trade-off of personal liberty for security and stable community as worth it. Eventually, monasteries didn't need to purchase and liberate slaves they then held in service. The children of this blacksmith or that laborer learned his father's trade and took over his craft when his father passed and tended to stay on the monastic land where he had been born and raised. As we've seen in previous lectures, and will see in enthralling detail later in the course, the Black Death produced all kinds of psychosocial responses. Some were understandable, a turn toward religion or abandonment of one's friends and loved ones in the face of death, or engaging in hedonistic activities like drinking, gambling, and sex to go out with a bang, as it were. Others were more extreme, like the flagellant movement, whose adherents traveled from town to town, engaging in public displays in which they whipped themselves and each other, an attempt to atone for the sins of the soul of mankind by punishing the flesh. Last time, we talked some about the Scandinavian folk tales of the old man and woman, or orphaned children, traveling with broom and shovel as symbols of mortality. And we heard, too, about some occasions of human sacrifice, in which a live person was buried in order to prevent the rest of the community from contracting the plague. In many parts of Russia, there was a psychosocial plague response called the one-day votive church, and it's one I've encountered nowhere else. Although these are documented as being constructed during outbreaks of plague that were slightly later than the initial wave of the mid-14th century, I think they're worth mentioning here because they're just so interesting. So as I noted a moment ago, as was the case in every other country or community that was hit with plague, the losses were devastating. From Russia, we get the by now familiar stories of plague sparing no one, whether peasant or noble. The Archbishop of Novgorod was called upon by the citizens of Pskov to come to their community and perform some religious services in the hope that this might appease God and that he would have mercy on them. The Archbishop granted their request, traveled to Pskov, performed the services, and then died of the plague on his way back to Novgorod. And it was all for naught, as the plague continued to rage in Pskov. Most of the ruling elite in Moscow also succumbed, which in the short term appeared to cause a serious destabilization with the political infrastructure. Within 1 week of the plague's arrival in Moscow in 1353, the metropolitan of that city, and this is a rank somewhat akin to bishop, was dead, and so was the Grand Prince Semen Ivanovich and his 2 sons, and then his brother and successor, Andrei. In the countryside, as we've seen, agricultural practices were severely disrupted by the sudden population loss. Mass graves became the norm, as there was no time to give all the victims a proper burial. Having tried everything else, many Russian communities came together and decided that they would build structures that have come to be called, and forgive my pronunciation here, I'm not a Russian scholar, obydenya kami. What's really interesting is that although there's clearly a religious impulse behind their building, there's this idea that by doing something dramatic, the people could get God's attention and maybe some measure of mercy. It's usually the secular community leaders who organize the building effort. We have documentation that at least 19 of these wooden structures were built, most of them in Pskov and Novgorod, with a few in Moscow and some in other cities. They were all constructed within the space of 24 hours, and what is most important in terms of the psychosocial aspect is that they were built with communal labor. There were some fascinating conditions, one might rightfully call them superstitions, attached to the building of these structures. First, the community would choose a location on which no structure had ever existed prior to that time. Then they gathered all new materials. The idea was that this building would be completely new from the ground up. All the able-bodied people of the town arrived at the designated site in the pre-dawn hours on the appointed day. Because it was still dark, they would set up numerous torches around the worksite so they could get started before the sun was properly up. Then, everyone labored until midnight, hauling wood, putting up walls, constructing a roof, etc., etc. The idea of performing a remarkable feat in a single day is attested in much of the folklore tradition of Eastern Slavic peoples, and this is probably the source of this impulse. Also implicit in the act of building was that there would be no pause in the labor. It had to be continuous, all day long, with no breaks. Certainly some of the individual laborers might pause for food or to rest for a bit, but the labor focused on the votive church itself could not stop. The idea here was that the continuous activity prevented Satan and other demons from finding a way in to contaminate the holy structure. As long as pious people labored on it without pause, Satan was held at bay, and then, when it was completed, there was no way for him to access it or defile it, because consecration would happen immediately. You can imagine how attractive the idea of building the structure might be for those people suffering from plague. There was no way to stop it. It was killing nobles and archbishops. So what could they do in the face of such an implacable enemy? It's human nature to want to do something, and the one-day votive church, the Obedenia Kami, provided exactly the kind of psychosocial outlet people were desperate for in the face of the Black Death. Building these sites remained fairly popular up until the 16th century or so. It's no coincidence, I think, that as this is the time when people started coming up with more rational, practical responses to plague, quarantine, for example. And since the outbreaks were less virulent, there was less of a need for such a dramatic, extreme response. Nonetheless, examining the popularity of constructing these one-day votive churches offers a fascinating window into the psyches of the common people who, because they were mostly illiterate, were unable to give us a sense of their reaction to the Black Death via words. These were mostly peasants who labored with their hands, and it seems fitting that they would respond to the threat of death in a fashion similar to how they had made their living. While we have these fascinating details about things like the Archbishop of Novgorod's ill-fated journey to Pskov, the growth of pustoshi and monastic estates, and the brief frenzy of building votive churches in a single day, we don't have much more in the way of evidence for how exactly the plague spread through Russia. But we do know that just as it had everywhere else, the Black Death brought great devastation on multiple levels: social, economic, religious, agricultural, political, you name it. The plague affected it and changed it. Although the people living through it cannot have known it at the time, with the end of 1353 came an end to the second great pandemic of plague the world has seen. The first had been the plague of Justinian in the late 6th century. The third pandemic would be in India and China at the very end of the 19th century. And it was the third pandemic that helped modern scientists figure out what those earlier two pandemics had been. But of the three, the second, which struck the medieval world with full force between the years of 1346 and 1353, was by far the most destructive event their recorded history had ever seen. The plague would return continually every decade or so, sometimes striking this area or that population, old or young, sickly or in the prime of health, some of more than others. But the world would never again see anything like the plague at its worst, which was between 1348 and 1350. The Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918, with a death toll of around 500 million worldwide, sounds like it far exceeds the death toll of the plague. But remember, we have to think in terms of population percentages. The Spanish flu is considered staggeringly devastating because it killed between 3 to 5% of the world's population. But consider that during its peak in the UK, for example, for every 1,000 people, there were 25 deaths. Now think of the Black Death. For every 1,000 people, there were 500 deaths. It can't really compare. Now that we've made our way through a definition and understanding of the etiology of plague and a more or less chronological analysis of its progression from the East through the medieval European world and then back east again, we're going to turn our attention to exploring the issue of plague from a more thematic perspective. As we've already briefly discussed on numerous occasions, one of the worst things about plague was people's inability to understand what was causing it and to come up with some way to combat it. we'll examine a variety of medical and scientific responses from throughout the medieval world. And here's a spoiler alert. While many of these theories are interesting and, dare I say, entertaining, they are also pretty much dead wrong about everything. But in examining them, we get a better view of the medieval mindset, which in turn offers a richer picture of that world than we would otherwise have. When the Black Death devastated the medieval world in the middle of the 14th century, people were by turns resigned, repentant, hedonistic, and terrified, sometimes experiencing each of these responses in quick succession or almost simultaneously. In addition to all of these, however, was a desperate desire to understand just what the hell was going on. Where had this thing come from? Why now? Why these people and not others? What could be done to stop it? How could you survive it or avoid getting infected in the first place? The greatest minds of the day turned their attention to these questions, and in the years immediately following the first outbreak in the West in 1347, dozens of plague treatises were composed and circulated. As you might guess, however, at a time when the theory of germ transmission did not yet exist and there were no antibiotics, there was little written that was of any real help. But looking at these medical and scientific theories offers a fascinating window onto the medieval world, not just regarding the plague outbreak, but in terms of how certain fields of knowledge were understood and valued, and how the medieval mind saw connections and parallels between individual people, humanity at large, and the whole cosmos. The most authoritative commentary on the plague came from the medical faculty at the University of Paris, who were charged by the French king, Philip VI, with coming up with an explanation for the crisis that was confronting medieval society. The text is quite long, and it has two parts. In the first section, the medical faculty offer 3 chapters that detail the causes of the plague. In part 2, they spend 7 chapters offering suggestions for remedies or steps one might take in the hope of having some effect on the plague. They start their tract in the way that innumerable college students have been taught to start their essays. They begin with a general and then get a little more specific. Quote, "We say that the distant and first cause of this pestilence was and is the configuration of the heavens." End quote. They note that on March 20th, 1345, there was a conjunction of 3 planets in Aquarius: Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and this conjunction somehow caused a, quote, "deadly corruption of the air around us," end quote. They cite no less an authority than Aristotle, plus earlier medieval philosophers such as Albertus Magnus, who had argued that, quote, "the conjunction of Mars and Jupiter causes a great pestilence in the air, especially when they come together in a hot, wet sign. For Jupiter, being wet and hot, draws up evil vapors from the earth, and Mars, because it is moderately hot and dry, then ignites the vapors, and as a result, there were lightnings, sparks, noxious vapors, and fires throughout the air," end quote. They go on to say that the effects of this are only intensified because Mars was in the sign of Leo just before the key period in question. Now, it's necessary to pause here and point out what is pretty obvious. The fields of astrology and astronomy, which we consider separate things today, were one and the same in the medieval world. While today astronomy is a science practiced by highly educated and extensively trained specialists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, astrology is usually performed by an underpaid copy editor who types up a very generalized horoscope prediction for each sign, and it then gets printed in the daily newspaper next to the crossword puzzle and advice columns. Astronomy is science. Astrology is, for lack of a better word, bunk. But this was not the belief in the Middle Ages, and you can imagine why. People had developed the ability to identify different planets and their orbits, and to map the night sky, and it must have seemed impossible that something so mysterious, awe-inspiring, and yet observable by those who were trained to do so could not have an effect on the Earth. Indeed, in the medieval educational system, one of the 7 liberal arts was astronomy, and in the Middle Ages, astronomy included within it what we think of today as astrology. A popular and useful scientific device in the medieval world that was used to calculate the positions of planets, sun, the moon, and latitude was something known as the astrolabe. Its origins go back to ancient Greece, but it was quite popular in the medieval world, and during the time of the plague, many scientists and scholars were consulting their astrolabes to try and get a handle on what was happening in the heavens. Indeed, Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English poetry, composed a treatise on the astrolabe, and that infamous pair of star-crossed lovers, Abelard and Eloise, actually named their son Astrolabe. And of course, if you know anything about astrology, you'll know that different astrological signs are associated with certain assigned qualities, not unlike the idea of the 4 humors that were assigned to the human body in the Middle Ages. And like the use of astrology, the theory of the 4 humors also was of great importance as medieval people tried to figure out how to deal with the plague most effectively. So in medieval medicine, which was based on the theories of the Greek physician Galen, basic health was determined by the balance of the humors in the body. These were considered the 4 main substances that regulated everything the body did. Blood was associated with air, phlegm with water, yellow bile with fire, and black bile with earth. And they were also connected to ideas about appearance and personality types. In turn, based on your personality type or dominant humor, a certain course of treatment for disease might be prescribed for you that would be different from the course prescribed for someone else who was suffering from the same affliction, but who had a different dominant humor. For example, if you had too much blood, or in medieval medical terms, you were too sanguine, your physician might actually perform bloodletting on you to try and bring your humors back into balance. If it sounds horrifying to think that you might try and heal a patient by draining blood out of him and thereby making him weaker and less able to fight off infection or disease, consider the fact that most medieval physicians also believed that blood circulated through different channels on different sides of your body. So sometimes you might be bled on the left side, sometimes the right, and sometimes both. If you had too much phlegm, and thus your body was too moist and too cold, your prescription would be to get yourself warmed up. Indeed, it's from this idea of the 4 humors that we get our modern use of the term phlegmatic. If someone is described in this way, it might seem because they are rather cold and self-centered. Too much yellow bile, and you were choleric or given to fits of anger. So if you had too much yellow bile, unless you were dry and hot, the prescription might be to give you a cold bath or make you sit out in the snow. In other words, the prescription might be the opposite of that given to a phlegmatic. Again, you can imagine that taking a person who is ill and immersing them in cold water is probably neither comfortable nor conducive to helping the immune system do its job. Also, there would probably be some bloodletting, no matter what your humor type, just because that was almost always the go-to to get your humors back into balance. If you had too much black bile, then you were melancholic or given to sadness. In order to cure you of this, laxatives would be the way to go. And again, probably more bloodletting. The same idea or kind of approach applied to the 12 astrological signs. Aquarius was an air sign, not a water sign as some might expect given the name, and Leo was a fire sign. If you put air and fire together, they burn hotter. Then you've got Mars, which is already considered a hot and dry planet. You can see how medieval people might have taken what they believed to be true about the nature of astrological signs, the nature of individual planets, and then looking at the attributes and the fact of a planetary conjunction, make some deductions that these things were related to the great pestilence that was raging through the medieval world. Besides the medical faculty at the University of Paris, plenty of other great minds of the day weighed in on the astrological causes of the plague. Oxford scholar Geoffrey de Meaux wrote his own plague treatise on the conjunction of the planets in 1345, but he says the Paris medical faculty is wrong to focus on Jupiter as being a contributor. It's really Mars and Saturn that we should be worried about, he says. Geoffrey goes on also to assert that eclipses have played a role in the current outbreak. Once again, 1345 is the key year. Quote, "It has been and is known by all astrologers that in the year 1345 there was a total eclipse of the moon of long duration on 18 March. At the longitude of Oxford, it began an hour after the moon rose. At that time, the two planets were in conjunction in Aquarius, and Mars was with them in the same sign within the light of Jupiter." End quote. He goes on to explain that, quote, "When the sun is directly opposite the moon, as occurs in a total eclipse, then the power of each of them reaches the earth in a straight line, and the mingling of the influence of sun and moon with that of the superior planets creates a single celestial force which operates in conformity with the nature of the superior planets, which have drawn to themselves the powers of the sun and moon." He observes that, on their own, the sun, moon, and planets would have minimal impact on the world. But when all their energies are combined and aligned, well, the Earth is in trouble. So activity in the heavens, whether it be planetary alignment, eclipses, certain planets being in certain quadrants of the sky, was regarded by multiple great minds of the day as the ultimate cause and source of the plague. But these writers also felt compelled to identify what they called the near cause or immediate cause of plague on Earth. So, while the general or primary cause is the bad air produced on Earth by this conjunction of planets in an air and fire sign, according to the medical faculty at the University of Paris, the near cause is that the pure air everyone breathes gets infected by these noxious vapors and spread about through gusts of wind. The Paris medical faculty suggests poisonous air from places like swamps, lakes, and unburied or unburned corpses probably contributed to the epidemic. And any medieval person who had had any experience with warfare or surviving a siege of a city knew that having corpses lying around was not conducive to the continued health of the population. This is why there were so many mass graves during the plague. It might have been easier to simply leave the dead where they fell or inside their homes, but enough civic leaders recognized the threat to sanitation if this were permitted to happen. Those people who were willing to take on the job of transporting and burying corpses were able to command very high wages during the plague years. While most medieval people believed that they were affected by astrology, some scholars of the day completely discounted the planetary conjunction/eclipse explanation. In fact, the Paris medical faculty added that, in addition to the planetary issue, quote, "Another possible cause of corruption, which needs to be borne in mind, is the escape of the rottenness trapped in the center of the Earth as a result of earthquakes, something which has indeed recently occurred." End quote. Some scholars felt quite strongly that this was the whole answer right there. In a chronicle from Germany, one scribe makes the argument that astrological conjunctions happen all the time, and there's not usually a plague occurring in the aftermath. But what's less common are earthquakes, and the scribe finds this the most plausible explanation on the following grounds. Quote, "When air that is full of vapors and earthy fumes is enclosed and shut up for a long time in the prison of the earth, it becomes so corrupted that it constitutes a potent poison to men. This is especially marked in caverns or deep inside the earth, as is often seen in the case of wells that have been unused for a long time. For when such wells are opened in order to be cleaned out, it often happens that the first man to enter is suffocated, and sometimes in turn, those who follow him." End quote. This seems logical as far as it goes, and then the scribe offers this commentary, quote, "And the common people are so ignorant that they blame this on a basilisk lurking inside." End quote. The anonymous chronicler notes that, quote, "It is a matter of scientific fact," end quote, that earthquakes are caused when noxious fumes build up inside the earth and finally burst out, and that there was an earthquake in Germany on St. Paul's Day at 1347, and after this, numerous people began to die from exposure to these vapors and fumes, which were then spread by storms and wind and lightning. Also, this cause makes more sense, because the planets should affect everyone on Earth the same, but from his own experience, the poor were being struck down much more quickly and in greater numbers than the rich. He has an answer for this, however. In the same vein as the medical theory of the humors, the chronicler argues that this is because the higher classes consume rich food and drink, which makes them hot and fumous, and quote, "What is inside them leaves no room for such fumes and blocks their entry." Still, even they won't be able to avoid it forever, he concedes. So while many medieval experts disagreed on the source, they did agree on the fact that there was some sort of bad air that served as the means by which the infection was transmitted, and they even came up with a name for it, which we still use today, miasma. Making the outbreak and the spread of miasma that much worse, according to almost every expert, was the fact that for the last few years, the weather across Europe had been really unpredictable. The Paris medical faculty affirmed that, quote, "Last winter was not as cold as it should have been, with a great deal of rain. The spring windy and latterly wet. Summer was late, not as hot as it should have been, and extremely wet. The weather very changeable from day to day and hour to hour. Autumn, too, was very rainy and misty." Now, what's really interesting about these claims is that they are partially right in their identification of the precipitants of plague, but they get the mechanisms totally wrong. So, for example, you recall from our lecture on England that every chronicler starts out by mentioning how much rain there had been before the plague broke out in Britain. Unusual weather patterns like this seem to have been the initial cause in Asia, when climate shifts caused the black rat population to move out of its traditional habitat and come into greater contact with human populations. Earthquakes, too, can disrupt rodent habitats and send the rats into greater contact with human populations. And we know that a few earthquakes took place at this time. In addition to the St. Paul's Day earthquake noted earlier, there was, in particular, in January 1348, on the Italian peninsula, a quake known as the Friuli quake, which scientists estimate registered 6.9 on the Richter scale, and which was felt all across Europe. And then, not too long after that, there were additional smaller quakes in both Italy and Germany. Just a couple months later, boom, the Black Death shows up. When there are a series of earthquakes followed by pestilential disease, it's pretty hard for the medieval mind not to see a connection. But it's interesting to note the way in which the scientific explanations, planets, earthquakes, eclipses, weather, are able to stand right alongside a belief that the Black Death was also a punishment from God. That interesting juxtaposition of beliefs is one we'll be talking about quite a bit in the lectures ahead. The weather also probably played a role in that the winters leading up to the plague outbreak were unusually warm, as the Paris medical faculty observed. The black rat flea usually goes into hibernation in the winter, but if the weather was unseasonably warm, some of the fleas might not have hibernated, which means that what we might call infection season was extended. And of course, the comment that infected air from unburied corpses might be a contributing factor is absolutely correct. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Paris medical faculty and the other scholars who weighed in on the plague didn't offer much in the way of optimism about avoiding the great pestilence. Here again, they turned to the theory of the four humors to explain their reasoning. Quote, "The bodies most likely to bear the stamp of this pestilence are those which are hot and moist. The following are also more at risk: bodies bunged up with evil humors because the unconsumed waste matter is not being expelled as it should. Those following a bad lifestyle with too much exercise, sex, and bathing. The thin and the weak and persistent warriors. Babies, women, and young people. And corpulent people with a ruddy complexion." End quote. However, they went on, if you were lucky enough to be mostly dry in your humors, that is, with more yellow bile and black bile than blood or phlegm, and if you had regular bowel movements so your body was purging excess waste, plus you didn't overexert yourself or overeat and live sensibly, well then, you just might make it. But what's the best thing to do when you have actually contracted the plague? We know that around 18 to 20% of those who came down with the bubonic form survived, but almost no one who contracted the pneumonic or septicemic form had a shot at beating the disease. Given the statistics, it's not much of a surprise that any medical advice about actual treatment tends to focus on the buboes. A scholar named John of Burgundy offered just such advice in his treatise, written around 1365, so after the first wave and then a couple of subsequent smaller ones had made their way through the medieval world. And he describes his treatments with the full confidence of someone who has managed to cure many of his patients. The first thing to do, he says, is to examine the buboes and figure out which organ is trying to expel the poison. Remember now that according to many medieval scientists, there are three principal organs at play here: the heart, the liver, and the brain. Quote, "If the infected blood is driven to the armpits, it can be deduced that the heart is oppressed and suffering, and so blood should be let immediately from the cardiac vein, but on the same side of the body. If the liver expels matter to the groin and it becomes visible next to the privy member towards the inside of the leg, then a vein should be opened in the foot on the same side of the body, between the big toe and the toe next to it." End quote. John then goes on to describe what to do if there's evidence of plague near what he calls the emunctories of the brain, in this case just below the ears or under the tongue. Quote, "If the poison appears at the emunctories of the brain, let blood from the cephalic vein above the median vein in the arm on the same side of the body. Next, a medicinal mixture should be administered to the patient, with some variation depending on the infected person's humors. If he is more choleric than sanguine, then, quote, a pennyweight of camphor should be added to a mixture of sandalwood, candied rose petals, and cold tragacanth, which is a kind of tree resin or gum sap, and this should be made into pills to be taken by the sick person several times a day. The buboes or tumors should also be treated directly. Many medieval physicians lanced the buboes on the logical assumption that they must be the site of concentrated poison in the body and that getting the poison out might affect healing. Some accounts indicate that a foul-smelling pus emerged from these lanced buboes, and the stench was so bad that other people in the room often vomited. John of Burgundy doesn't advise lancing the buboes, but he does offer a recipe for a kind of plaster to be put on them The theory being that this would help both to draw all the poison into the bubo and then to calcify the bubo so that the poison stays there and can't get back into the rest of the body. Now, as you might imagine, the mortality rates for those who came in contact with plague-infected persons was pretty high. Priests and doctors were especially likely to succumb, which presented a problem, since the prevailing theory was that the plague was spread by infected air or miasma. Many medieval medical experts recommended countering the bad air with something sweet-smelling, hence the reference to the pocket full of posies in the children's rhyme. We have evidence that people walked around holding flowers or spices in front of their faces, or that they sewed strong and pleasant-smelling herbs into the sleeves of their clothing, which they could then hold up in front of their faces. You may recall from an earlier lecture that there was a belief in some parts of England that one type of bad air could be countered with another, which led to the weird spectacle of people deliberately seeking out public latrines and gathering around them to inhale deeply. Obviously, neither the good smell approach nor the bad smell approach had any sort of real effect on the plague. But in an attempt to make the good smell anti-miasma theory workable, plague doctors hit upon an idea for a kind of medieval hazmat suit that probably accidentally offered some protection against plague. The earliest full-scale drawing we have of a plague doctor's costume comes from the 17th century, but we do have references from the 14th century to the fact that the plague doctors looked like beaked birds. So we can be reasonably sure the later drawing reflects the reality of the 14th century costume in its most important detail, which is the mask. Now, the mask comes into usage because it's pretty much impossible to treat a plague patient while holding good-smelling herbs in front of your face with one hand. So a beak-like contraption was invented. The doctor could fill the long beak with flowers or herbs and spices and strap it onto his face so that he could have the benefit of the good air while keeping his hands free. In the early days, there was probably just a simple cutout for the eyes, but later versions seem to have actually had glass inserts there. Before he put the mask on, however, the doctor would first don something kind of like hip waders that would be used in fishing today, and over that, he would fasten a long coat. He would complete this fashionable look with some gloves and boots. All of the material was probably made of some kind of oiled leather that was infused with more sweet-smelling herbs and spices. The plague doctor would be easily identifiable by the fact that he carried a long pole, which served many purposes. It could be used to remove or set aside the clothing of the infected, and it could also be used to disperse people or push them out of the way. A broad-brimmed hat would top it all off, and also serve as an identifying marker for his occupation. I imagine some people with ill loved ones would seek him out, and others, upon seeing the distinctive costume, would run the other way. But for the doctor, at least, this outfit actually provided some real protection. There was a physical barrier between the physician and the fleas or the bodily fluids of the infected person, and so I don't doubt that plenty of medieval plague doctors beat the odds, but I'm guessing that most would put it down to the good air they inhaled through the beak. Once you see a contemporary image of a plague doctor dressed in full regalia, I imagine you'll have one of two reactions. Either you'll be freaked out and start having nightmares, or you'll have a great idea for next year's Halloween costume. Or maybe both. And speaking of freaking out, in the next lecture, we'll meet the flagellants who responded to the Black Death by traveling from town to town and publicly whipping themselves. We'll also look at other psychosocial responses to the plague, including hedonism and good old dogged pragmatism. If you thought plague doctors were interesting, just wait. What would you do if you knew the end of the world was at hand? What would you do if you watched your neighbors, your family, your friends, your community leaders succumb to a horrible illness from which there seemed no escape, for which there was no defense and no cure? But what if only half of your friends, family, and acquaintances died from this terrible illness? Would you be optimistic and think you might be one of the lucky ones to survive? Would you be pessimistic and assume that you were next? Would you be pragmatic or resigned? Would you want to squeeze every bit of pleasure out of life that you could, or would you change your sinful ways in the hope that God might be merciful and forgiving? Or would you just keep on going, figuring that routine and tradition would be the kind of string that holds the package together, and that they would help you keep your sanity in the face of an implacable threat that was like no other anyone in living memory had ever seen? When the Black Death struck the medieval world in 1347, the people who were living through the Great Mortality were surely asking themselves exactly these kinds of questions. And because, like I always say, people then and people now are more alike than they are different, the responses were as varied as you might expect those of the citizens of the modern world confronting such devastation would be. In our previous lectures, we've caught some glimpses of how medieval people dealt with the arrival of the Great Pestilence. You'll remember the story about the villagers in a small town outside Paris who were dancing with the light because the Black Death had so far spared them, but who were then struck down by a freak hailstorm. You'll remember Pope Clement VI in Avignon, spending his days pacing back and forth between two roaring fires on the advice of his personal physicians. You'll remember the increase in religious fervor among the general populace, with some taking that response to an extreme, praying more earnestly, fasting more frequently, and going on pilgrimage. Going on pilgrimage was a common enough thing to do even before the Black Death arrived, but when it arrived, people started to do this in larger and larger numbers. But in the face of the plague, more people decided to do what I like to think of as supersizing those pilgrimages. For example, by doing some of it by crawling instead of walking. In this lecture, we're going to look a little more in depth at responses like those of the people who whipped themselves, the flagellants, and the people who decided that the Black Death was an excuse for hedonism, or the people who sought to alleviate the horror of the Great Pestilence by making a children's game out of it. You'll recall that many scholars have long believed that the children's rhyme, "Ring around a rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down," was a response to the Black Death, although there are some today who question if this is really the case. And of course, there are the people who just kept on chugging along. In exploring the wide variety of human responses to the death and destruction of the plague, we'll see some extremes of behavior, yes, but we'll also see plenty of people responding in much the same way your doctor might advise you today if you got the flu. Rest, drink, get plenty of fluids, eat healthy food, etc., etc. As we know by now, one of the worst things about the Black Death was that people living in uninfected parts of Europe knew that it was coming their way. Letters, verbal accounts, medical treatises, and pilgrims flocking to holy sites brought stories of death in the most miserable of fashions. Louis Eligan, a Flemish man at the papal court in Avignon, wrote a letter detailing his experience with the plague and sent it home. Among other details in that missive, he noted that the people living in Avignon and its environs had taken certain measures to try and avoid getting sick. One of these was not to use any spices that had arrived from the East within the past year, a generally sensible precaution given that everyone seemed to recognize that the plague was coming from the East, spread in its first wave by merchants and sailors bringing goods for sale. Eligan goes on to give advice to his family and friends back home. Quote, "I am writing to you, most dearly beloved, so that you should know in what peril we are now living. And if you wish to preserve yourselves, the best advice is that a man should eat and drink moderately and avoid getting cold and refrain from any excess, and above all, mix little with people, unless it be with a few who have healthy breath. But it is best to stay at home until the epidemic has passed. According to astrologers, the epidemic takes 10 years to complete its cycle, of which 3 have now elapsed, and so it is to be feared that in the end it will have encircled the whole world, although they say that it will affect cold regions more slowly. End quote. While Eilígan's letter seems to provide a pretty rational and measured response to the threat of the Black Death, other people opted for more extreme countermeasures. Perhaps the most dramatic and memorable response to the Black Death came from a group of people known as the Flagellants. Now, there had been flagellant movements in the century before the appearance of the Black Death, but most of these had flared up only briefly and then died out. But with the arrival of the plague, they showed up again in force. When they appeared on the scene one day in 1348, one chronicler called them, quote, a race without a head that aroused universal wonder by their sudden appearance in huge numbers, end quote. Although a large proportion of the Flagellants seem to have hailed from what is today Germany, or the Netherlands, or the Rhineland, Flagellants were found from England to Italy and everywhere in between, in a sudden and seemingly spontaneous eruption of extreme faith. One chronicler notes, quote, they were called cross-bearers, either because they followed a cross carried before them on their travels, or because they prostrated themselves in the form of a cross during their processions. They were called flagellants because of the whips which they used in performing public penance. Each whip consisted of a stick with 3 knotted thongs hanging from the end. 2 pieces of needle-sharp metal were run through the center of the knots from both sides, forming a cross, the ends of which extended beyond the knots for the length of a grain of wheat or less. Using these whips, they beat and whipped their bare skin until their bodies were bruised and swollen, and blood rained down, spattering the wall nearby. End quote. Take it from me, that's actually a pretty mild description of their behavior, as we'll see in a moment. The Flagellants thought that by punishing their flesh, they could atone for sinful behavior, and by doing this publicly and traveling from town to town, they were arguably not only saving themselves, but also performing generous acts of penance on behalf of the rest of humanity who were too weak or too scared to take up the cause of atonement themselves. This is part of the larger social ideal of the 3 estates or the 3 orders. As you may recall, medieval society was ideally organized into 3 groups: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. The idea here was that each order supported the others. The knights fought to protect society, especially the church, whose members were forbidden to take up arms. For their part, the clergy would spend their days praying for the rest of society, helping to alleviate the sinfulness of the world and also to move the souls of sinners out of purgatory more quickly by praying for them. And those who work, which was most of society, produced food and other goods, which they supplied to the first 2 orders to support them in their work of protection and of prayer. So the Flagellants considered themselves to be performing the work of the 2nd order, seeking to save the world by very public displays of self-punishment. The theory the Flagellants were operating under was that because Christ was whipped before his crucifixion, those who chose to inflict this punishment on themselves were joining with Christ in his passion, And to be sure, throughout the Middle Ages, many religious people sought to punish their flesh as a means of refining their souls. But the difference is, in most cases, this punishment was supposed to be private. The most popular approach was to wear an article of clothing known as a hair shirt underneath one's outer clothing and against one's skin. From what I understand about hair shirts, the closest equivalent today would be to wear a vest of steel wool that somehow is also infected with lice and fleas right against your chest. But ideally, no one besides the penitent and his confessor, who may have instructed him or her to undertake this form of penance, should know about this. If you are walking around showing off your super uncomfortable clothing so that everyone can see just how sorry and contrite you are, then that's not true penitence. That's actually the sin of pride. Look at me, I'm so holy. I bet I'm in more pain than you are. Impressed, jealous. So clearly, with their very public approach to penance, the flagellants were a bit of a problem, although they attracted an impressive following when they first showed up during the initial wave of the Black Death. You might say that desperate times call for desperate measures. As I noted a few moments ago, the first recorded appearances of flagellants dates to the middle of the 13th century, so around 100 years before the Black Death. But then, with the arrival of the Great Mortality, they suddenly started sprigging up everywhere. The great thing about this is that we have all kinds of first-person eyewitness accounts of their behavior. One chronicler relates that, quote, when they came to cities, towns, and villages, they formed themselves into procession, with hoods or hats pulled down over their foreheads, and sad and downcast eyes, end quote. They would process this way through the town, singing a hymn until they reached the town's church. So far, so good. This doesn't seem too out of the ordinary for a religious group confronting their own mortality. But then the real show would begin. The German Chronikon Anrici de Ervordia gives us an exemplary description of the usual program of their behavior. According to this account, after the flagellants had entered a town, they would lock themselves in the community's church, strip themselves almost naked, and then burst out of the north doors of the church wearing only loincloths. Next, they would arrange themselves on the ground in front of the various entrances to the church. Some of them might lie in the shape of a cross, but others positioned their bodies on their sides or backs or on their faces in some sort of physical code for the sin they were most guilty of. Then, one of the group's members would go around and whip each of the penitents who were lying on the ground in turn. And once he was done, someone else would take over the whip, and it would all begin again. It was, to say the least, a spectacle that attracted the attention of the locals. If you've seen Ingmar Bergman's classic masterpiece, The Seventh Seal, you may recall the scene when the traveling family and the citizens of the town where they stopped for a moment are all taken aback by what looks like a procession of zombies staggering through the center of town, whipping themselves as they go. Those were the flagellants. Although their time on the European stage was relatively brief, they put on quite a show. The chronicler Fritz Klosner adds some interesting details when he describes the flagellant movement's activities in 1349. Quote, "You should know that whenever the flagellants whipped themselves, there were large crowds and the greatest pious weeping that one should ever see. The burghers in the cities gave them money from the city coffers so that they could buy flags and candles. The flagellant brothers also assumed great holiness and said that great things were happening by their will." End quote. Okay, fair enough. times were desperate enough to call for a desperate response. But then things got really crazy. Quote, "They said a statue of Our Lady had been sweating. They also said that cattle in Erstein had been talking. They also dragged a dead child about in a meadow around their ring as they whipped themselves and wanted to make it live again, but that didn't happen. Then also women took off and wandered through the land and whipped themselves. Then also young boys and children took up the flagellant's pilgrimage. After that, the people did not want to give them any more contributions for candles and flags." End quote. The chronicler Gilles de Moussy described the scene in Tournai, recalling what happened when a group of about 180 flagellants from Liège entered the town. Quote, "Those carrying the crucifixes, banners, and candles led the way, and they began to form a circle with both the singers and the respondents whipping themselves, and the song was sung in such a way that they had to prostrate themselves on the ground 30 times. Everyone fell with his whole body flat on his chest, and they formed a cross out of their arms and body. And getting up on their knees, they performed various bodily torments to such an extent that those watching were amazed and wept and had compassion on their sufferings." End quote. You might recall that the flagellants made an appearance in Avignon when the plague struck there, and the Pope rather uneasily allowed them to practice this behavior for a very short time. But there was a pretty quick consensus on the part of most church officials that the flagellant movement was excessive and dangerous, and perhaps most concerning, the participants started to think that they had a right to act as preachers. In the same account from the Chronicon Enrici de Ervordia, we read that many members of the flagellant movement, quote, "persistently took upon themselves the job of preaching. They did not think or speak of the clergy and the sacraments of the church with proper reverence, but rather with contempt." End quote. Now this was a serious problem, as it was a usurpation of ecclesiastical authority and a threat to the religious hierarchy. Pope Clement rather swiftly issued a bull against the flagellant movement, and those who refused to submit to his correction were excommunicated. The Chronicle, however, states that, quote, "The flagellants ignored and scorned the sentence of excommunication pronounced against them by bishops. They took no notice of the papal order against them, until princes, nobles, and the more powerful citizens started to keep them at a distance. Afterward, they disappeared as suddenly as they had come, as apparitions or ghosts are routed by mockery." End quote. And indeed, 4 months after Clement issued his bull, the French king got on board and condemned the movement as well. And by 1350, the flagellants were on their way to disappearing once again. In contrast to the flagellant movement, we have examples of people who went the other direction, figuring that if these were going to be their last days on earth, they might as well spend them doing something pleasurable. The accounts of these behaviors are less detailed and more anecdotal than what we get in the chronicle accounts of the flagellants. They are more along the lines of gossip. For example, quote, "Many people report that the monks and nuns have all given themselves over to every kind of debauchery," end quote. While we see a lot of those kinds of statements, it's not necessarily the case that all or even most of them are true. One of the most famous of these accounts comes from a fairly reliable source, Giovanni Boccaccio, who in the introduction to the Decameron famously detailed the horrors of the plague when it first struck Florence. He wrote of victims dropping dead in the streets, of the dead buried in mass graves, of people abandoning not only the city, but also their friends and neighbors. But then he says, quote, "Others maintained that an infallible way of warding off this appalling evil was to drink heavily, enjoy life to the full, go round singing and merrymaking, gratify all of one's cravings, whatever the opportunity offered, and shrug the whole thing off as a one enormous joke. They would visit one tavern after another, drinking all day and night to immoderate excess." End quote. And to be sure, this does seem to have been the case. Some people gave in to desire and excess, but I don't think that any full-fledged drunken orgies were taking place on a regular basis. Rather, I think that in some of the accounts we read, what we see is the writer expressing a sense that the whole of society, as it has existed up to this point, is coming to an end. A description of scandalous behavior on the part of survivors is merely an exclamation point to the death sentence of the plague. Did you all see what I did there? Death sentence, exclamation point. For example, in John of Reading's chronicle account of a later outbreak of plague in 1361, we see signs that, in John's eyes at least, the social order was completely breaking down. Quote, "This year, the mortality was particularly of males who were devoured in great numbers by the pestilence. However, the greatest cause of grief was provided by the behavior of the women. Widows, forgetting the love they had borne towards their first husbands, rushed into the arms of foreigners, or in many cases, of kinsmen, and shamelessly gave birth to bastards conceived in adultery. It was even claimed that in many places, brothers took their sisters to wife. Afterwards, many, regardless of status, class, or degree, no longer worried about sexual lapses, for they now regarded fornication, incest, or adultery as a game rather than a sin." End quote. Now, although John is speaking of an outbreak that's a decade or so later than the first wave of plague, he makes a point of saying that this licentiousness is exactly like last time. And certainly, there were plenty of stories about communities or groups of people giving into hedonism in a sort of last going-away party. Indeed, one response to the plague seems to have been something called choreomania, in which people participated in crazy dancing parties. We tend to see the choreomaniacs during later outbreaks, especially in the 1370s, but we can regard them as the successors to those people who gave in to hedonism during the first outbreak in the 1340s. This movement, like the flagellant movement, seems to have sprung up mostly in the Rhineland and Flanders, especially in the towns of Cologne, Metz, Liège, and Trèves. According to an anonymous contemporary chronicler, in response to a new wave of plague, quote, "People began to dance and rush about. They formed groups of 3 and danced in one place for half a day, and while dancing, they fell to the ground and allowed others to trample on their bodies. By this, they believed that they could cure themselves of illness. In the town of Cologne alone, more than 500 dancers were to be found." End quote. What's even more scandalous, according to this chronicler, is that most of the women who participated in these dances were both unmarried and pregnant. Clearly, what's happening here is that we're seeing a link being suggested between licentious behavior and God's decision to send the plague to ravage humanity. Indeed, another chronicler, a Dutchman named Radulfus de Rivo, noted in his chronicle that, quote, "They engaged without shame in their dances, both sexes as if possessed, in churches and in houses, and while dancing, they sang and invoked the names of unheard-of devils. When the dance was over, the devils tormented them with violent pains in their chests, so that with terrible voices they shouted that they were dying, end quote. But not everyone looked at these dancing parties and their participants with disdain. Indeed, some communities, especially during later outbreaks of plague, would actually organize dances for the whole town. In some instances, these dances were supposedly meant to act as some sort of force that would keep the plague at bay. We have a story that the citizens of Basel, during a plague outbreak, would go and dance around a pine tree on a plain known as the Witch's Mead until the infection had worked its way through their community and was on to the next. In other communities, these dance parties were conceived of as a way of trying to lift the depression that was sure to attend an outbreak of disease. Indeed, celebratory annual dance parties that still take place to this day in many towns trace their origins back to the days of plague. In Munich, for example, there is the Schäflertanz and the Metzgersprung, celebrations held in the modern period that, according to tradition, first came into being as a response to the plague. And there are accounts as well of a general mood of licentiousness. In plenty of instances, people seem to have given themselves over to pleasure. The scholar Johannes Knoll cites one particular instance in Paris during a plague outbreak. Knoll notes that an anonymous chronicler writes, quote, "Without heed of what is decent or indecent, the people live only guided by their own instincts, and do by day or night, alone or in company, whatever their inclination may prompt them. And it is not only the laity that behave thus, but the nuns in the convents also, neglecting their rules, abandon themselves to carnal lust, and deem that by voluptuousness and excess they will prolong their lives." But again, these accounts of dancing and licentiousness are not as detailed or as convincing as the accounts we see about the other extreme, the flagellants, and, to a lesser degree, a general increase in religiosity. We know that many more people were going on pilgrimage, and we see an increase in donations to the clergy and the church, all of which suggests that people were trying to be more pious in an attempt to appease God's wrath, or, at the very least, spend as little time as possible in purgatory when death did at last come for them. Still, there are some clues about the proliferation of naughty behavior. For example, in the midst of serious outbreaks in the Italian city of Florence and in the town of Tournai in what is present-day Belgium and other places, a slew of what we might call moral legislation was passed. These laws strictly forbade or put limits on activities like prostitution and gambling. And as anyone who studies the past knows, you usually don't have to have a rule against something unless people are actually doing it. But it might not be the case that there was a sudden uptick in prostitution and gambling activities in these and other cities in the face of the great mortality. What's more likely is that when confronted with the great pestilence, the city leaders, most likely being Christian believers, were trying to curtail every sin they could so as to atone before God. So it may not be that illicit and hedonistic activities increased, but rather that for the first time, civic leaders really cared about these things and opted not to turn a blind eye. I personally think the truth lies somewhere in between, and I'm quite sure that while it may not have been the norm, in several places, people gave up trying to do what they thought was right and gave in to doing whatever they wanted. While the examples of hedonism, flagellation, and everything in between we've explored here open a fascinating window onto the variety of psychosocial responses to the plague, the most horrifying is, without question, the widespread pogroms against the Jewish communities that sprang up in the wake of the Black Death. Many people were desperate to find someone, anyone, to blame for the misery and death raining down upon them. And Jewish communities, which were usually isolated or ghettoized in relationship to a major town and whose members were limited to certain professions, often the least desirable, like moneylending, were in the unfortunate position of being a perfect target for the hysteria that swept through much of Europe from 1347 to 1350 and beyond. It wasn't the first time the Jews had been singled out and punished for imaginary crimes, nor, as we all know, would it be the last. We'll explore the atrocities committed against European Jews in the wake of the Great Mortality, but we'll also, hopefully, take some small measure of comfort and inspiration from the examples of those Jews who stood resolutely and bravely against the charges leveled at them, and from the examples of some of their non-Jewish neighbors who sought to protect them from the hysteria that was sweeping the land. The arrival of the plague in medieval Europe in late 1347 marked the beginning of one of the most devastating events humanity had ever experienced. In the face of an implacable and unstoppable enemy for which there seemed no defense and no cure, people responded in just about every way you can imagine. Some engaged in a form of denial or resignation, putting their heads down and continuing on doggedly with their everyday existence. Others turned to religion, praying, fasting, going on pilgrimage, and in extreme cases, engaging in public self-flagellation as an attempt to atone for the sins of humanity, because surely God had sent this affliction as punishment. Others threw up their hands and said, "Screw it, let's go have a party so we can have some fun before we die." But others were looking for someone to blame, and they found those someones in the Jewish communities that existed throughout the medieval world. In order to understand how this horrific scapegoating came about, it's necessary to back up a bit and understand a little bit about the history of the Jews in the medieval world. Now, this is a huge topic, and I'm oversimplifying here quite a bit. But here's the short version of the story of the rise of anti-Semitism. There had been Jewish communities throughout the medieval world for centuries. For example, they had been in what is today Spain, on the Iberian Peninsula, since as early as the 2nd century. Cosmopolitan and central trading hubs like Sicily had also long had a diverse population that included Jews, Muslims, various kinds of Christians, and pretty much any other group that existed in the Middle Ages, and they were all living together in relatively peaceful fashion. Now, you may recall that around the year 1000, the population of the medieval world was around 75 million people. And at that time, there was a warming period, known as the Little Climatic Optimum, that basically made life easier if you were part of a rural agrarian society. Winters were mild, growing seasons were longer. This climate shift also changed patterns in the fishing waters off the British coast and the North Sea, which meant that there was an abundance of protein swimming around for the taking. Advances in farming technology also meant that crop yields were even higher than they had been. All of this put together meant that suddenly there was a population boom. With better nutrition, more women were able to carry more pregnancies to term and survive delivery. With better nutrition available in a milder climate, more people were less susceptible to the illnesses that usually carried off a good portion of the population, especially children under 5. And as a result of all these factors working together, by the year 1300, the population of Western Europe had doubled from what it had been in the year 1000. What this meant in practical terms is that where there had been plenty of land before, now there was a land crunch. In the year 1000, people didn't much care who their neighbors were. There was plenty of land to go around. By the 12th century, they were starting to notice that good arable land was becoming scarce, and as human beings have done since time immemorial, people sought to protect their own families first, and then those with whom they identified on a broader level. Starting in the 12th century, this led to what historian R.I. Moore has called the formation of a persecuting society. Marginal groups who had been tolerated were now further marginalized. A persecuting mentality manifested itself with regard to groups like lepers and heretics and other non-mainstream Christians. And yes, those did exist. The medieval church was not as monolithic as some people like to think. Also, women, people whose sexuality was considered perhaps not heteronormative. And of course, the biggest marginalized group and easiest target, the Jews. Basically, if some way could be hit upon to deprive significant demographic groups of wealth, status, and property, then people found a way to do this in order to secure more power and property for themselves and the groups of which they considered themselves a part. Suddenly, a whole crop of regulations came into being that essentially took the right to farm or engage in certain trades and crafts away from the Jews and gave them the right to practice only the least preferred trades in medieval society. Money lending, for example. The whole idea of charging interest on a loan was considered the sin of usury by the medieval church. How could you turn 20 shillings into 25 without any goods changing hands? It was like making something out of nothing and was thus problematic. Because of this, Christians could not engage in what we today consider a basic banking practice. But people in the medieval world still needed loans. So they got around this by allowing the Jews to engage in this practice. The attitude being that they were already sinners because they did not recognize Jesus as the Messiah. I'm sure they thought they had come up with a rather neat solution to the problems attendant upon a burgeoning capitalist society. And of course, the Jews could always convert and be saved, at which point they would have to give up the practice of money lending. But surely then there would be another group upon whom this task could be conferred. Also starting around the 12th century, many Jewish communities now had restrictions on where they lived. In many places they were ghettoized into a Jewish quarter that usually had some sort of curfew, and that was often actually walled off from the main community to which it was attached. The French King Philip II expelled the Jews from Paris in 1182, but then, after confiscating their property, he brought some of them back on the condition that they work exclusively for him as bankers. And the Jews were expelled altogether from England by King Edward I in 1290. This had a snowball effect. The Jews were isolated and confined to unpopular occupations. Those occupations were unpopular because you had to do things like try and collect money from people who might not have it, or you might have to take collateral away from them if they defaulted on a loan. This made the Jews even more unpopular, as you might imagine. Just think of the character Shylock from Shakespeare, and what you've got is a recipe for anti-Semitism. Now, let's add to that the crusading fervor that swept Europe when, in 1095, Pope Urban II called for Christian forces to head to the Middle East and retake Jerusalem and the rest of the Holy Land from the Muslim rulers who controlled it. Several of the Crusaders, on their way overland through Europe, got to the area of the Rhineland, which had several large Jewish populations, and they apparently thought to themselves, hey, we're going all this way to convert or kill some infidels, but here are non-Christians right in our own backyard. Let's start with them. The first-person and chronicle accounts of these events are horrifying in the picture they paint, with a couple of small bright spots. One is the steadfast bravery and resolution of the Jews, who refused to convert, and in some cases, killed their own family members in an act of mercy before the Crusaders could do so. And another bright spot can be found in the examples of some Christian leaders, both secular and religious, who tried to shelter and protect the Jews from the hysterical anti-Semitism that was raging through the Crusader ranks. The bishops of the respective towns of Mainz, Speyer, and Worms, for example, tried to shelter groups of Jews within the walls of his own households, but angry mobs proved too much for his defenses. Somehow, these horrific acts seem to further normalize the marginal position of the Jews in many communities, and when the Black Death struck some 2.5 centuries after the onset of crusading fervor, once again, the Jews were a convenient scapegoat for a population desperately looking for someone to blame for the horrific event they were experiencing. Some chronicles make a point of saying that the accusations that Jews were causing the plague by poisoning wells and other water sources for various towns was obviously wrong, because Jews were dying in numbers equal to the mortality rates of non-Jews. But what's really interesting is that other chronicles claim that in some places, the Jewish population seemed relatively unaffected compared to the mainstream population. For a long time, most scholars assumed this was a lie, plain and simple, meant to bolster the accusations against the Jewish populations. But some have theorized that there may have been some truth to this claim in at least a few communities. How can this be? Well, first of all, we have to consider that the Jewish population in many places, as I said a moment ago, was ghettoized, confined to a particular part of a town or community, and very often there were actual physical boundaries or walls marking off the Jewish quarter from the rest of the city. This would have reduced their direct contact with a plague-infested Christian community. Another thing that might support this idea that the Jews suffered fewer losses in some areas has to do with a theory surrounding the ritual practices associated with the holy celebration of Passover. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, one of the rituals associated with Passover is ridding the home of chametz. This means any foodstuffs made of wheat, barley, rye, spelt, and oats. These things must be cleared out of the house, and this includes some serious sweeping and scrubbing. Not even a crumb should remain. For the duration of the holiday, unleavened bread, or matzah, is consumed. Well, guess what happens if you get rid of all foodstuffs made of cereal grains in your house? Your rat problem diminishes. If there's no food to consume, then the rats are going to move on. And if you've gone so far as to actually scrub out your grain bins, and all your neighbors have too, and you're following these protocols for several days, then your whole community will have less of a rat problem. No rats, no fleas. No fleas, no bubonic plague. So in some cases, it may actually have been the case that at least a few Jewish communities suffered fewer losses than the Christian towns to which they were connected. And if you put that together with the greatest mortal threat humanity had pretty much ever encountered up until that time, well, you can see how the situation might give rise to a violent anti-Semitic response. So this was the basic situation in many communities when plague broke out. As they attempted to get to the root cause of what was causing the great mortality, and their suspicions fell on the Jews of each community, many leaders took it upon themselves to round up some Jews, put them to the question, in other words, torture them, and then get a confession about what was happening and how they were going about it. For example, we have a chronicle account of a Franciscan friar named Hermann Gigas, who, when he attempted to explain the origins of the Black Death, noted, quote, "Some say that it was brought about by the corruption of the air. Others, that the Jews planned to wipe out all the Christians with poison, and had poisoned wells and springs everywhere. And many Jews confessed as much under torture, that they had bred spiders and toads in pots and pans, and had obtained poison from overseas, and that not every Jew knew about this wickedness, only the more powerful ones, so that it would not be betrayed." It's pretty obvious here that these confessions were forced, made under the duress of torture methods variously identified as thumbscrews, the rack, the wheel, and many, many more. The confession played into the fears of an already paranoid populace by clearly suggesting that this was a well-thought-out campaign, organized and run at the highest levels of the Jewish community. In short, it was a conspiracy. And like I always say, people then and people now are more the same than they are different, and everyone knows that people love a good conspiracy theory. As a result of this confessed information, according to Ehrman, throughout Germany, many communities had blocked up their wells in order to avoid being poisoned, and they were traveling long distances to procure drinking water, or even were getting drinking water from the local rivers, which in the Middle Ages was the equivalent of drinking out of the toilet. And then the pogroms against the Jews continued to spread, mostly throughout the German-speaking lands. So from present-day Austria to the Netherlands, including present-day Switzerland and Germany, with pogroms also taking place in parts of what is today considered France and Spain. Chronicler Heinrich Trukes offers one of many relentlessly horrifying catalogues of death in 1348. Quote, "First, Jews were killed or burnt in Sölden in November. Then in Zofingen they were seized, and some put on the wheel. Then in Stuttgart they were all burnt. The same thing happened during November in Landsberg." The catalog continues and continues. On December 20th, in Horv, they were burnt in a pit, and when the wood and straw had been consumed, some Jews, both young and old, still remained half alive. The stronger of them snatched up cudgels and stones and dashed out the brains of those trying to creep out of the fire. End quote. Once the persecution had started in 1348, it continued well into 1349. As Heinrich says, what people discovered that the stories of poisoning were undoubtedly true, they rose as one against the Jews. The means of execution here were truly shocking. For example, in the town of Basel, special wooden houses were constructed. The Jews of the community were shut up inside them, and then those structures were set on fire. The main structure in Basel was built on an island in the Rhine River, and in Strasbourg, one of these structures was erected in the Jewish cemetery itself. In a disturbing footnote, Heinrich mentions the fact that not all of the members of the Jewish communities were executed at this time. Some, he tells the reader, were kept back to be burnt on the third day after the Nativity of the Virgin. Imagine that you had witnessed the slaughter of friends, neighbors, and family, but your life was spared for now. And then you had to spend the next few days waiting for your own death. I would hope that for most of us, this just sounds completely insane. How could this possibly have happened? 3 moments are key to understanding how the pogroms came to be. The first is the famous Confession of Jews in the region of Savoy, which circulated regularly to other towns in the medieval world as a warning as to what could happen to them should they not be ready to confront what was apparently an international conspiracy. The second watershed moment in Jewish persecution involved the citizens of Strasbourg. And the third major event, the horrifying climax of anti-Semitic action during the Black Death, occurred in the German town of Cologne. Okay, so first of all, this confession from the region of Savoy, the Castellan of Chillon, a town that was under control of the Counts of Savoy during much of the Middle Ages, but that today is part of Switzerland, wrote a letter addressed to the citizens of Strasbourg, in which he says, quote, "The people of Bern have a copy of the Inquisition and confession of the Jews dwelling in their neighborhood, who were involved in putting poison into the wells there and in several other places." End quote. The main confession supposedly came from a man named Bellavini, who, after several days of torture, admitted not only to poisoning wells, but to it being part of an international Jewish conspiracy. He then proceeded to give details about the poison itself that make it clear to any modern reader that none of this is even remotely true. Bellavini attests that, quote, "The Rabbi Jacob sent him, by a Jewish boy, some poison, about the size of an egg, in the form of a powder, enclosed in a leather bag, accompanied by a letter, commanding him on pain of excommunication, and by the obedience he owed to the Jewish law, to put the poison into the larger public wells of the town, in order to poison the people using them." End quote. When pressed on the source of this poison, Bellavini claimed it came from the basilisk, which, if you know your medieval-themed fantasy literature, is a mythical serpent-type creature. The confession goes on to say that Bellavini named others who were in on the conspiracy, and then it lists those names. Many certainly innocent individuals get singled out, including one Samolay of Villeneuve, a certain Aquatus of Montreux, and the unfortunate Vivian, Jacob, Aquatus, and Sonatus of Evian. Yes, the Evian the water comes from. Bellavini supposedly attests to poisoning the well Ectonon himself, and goes on to relate how he traveled throughout the countryside with these basilisk-derived poisons, usually in a dose about the size and shape of a walnut or small egg. The document also makes a point of stating that later, when the torture was over, Bellavini was asked the same questions again, and that he gave the same answers as before. So this letter was sent by the leaders of the town of Chillon to various other towns in the area, and most of the recipients reacted with the hysteria we've now come to expect when it comes to the Black Death. What's interesting, as we'll see in a moment, is that the town of Cologne was one of the few communities whose leaders viewed this supposed confession with a pronounced skepticism. Upon receiving news of this confession, they did not respond with violent panic and hysteria. One town that did react with particular extremism was the community of Strasbourg. We know from surviving archival evidence that the leaders of Strasbourg requested and received information from at least 17 different neighboring towns as to what they thought was best to do to handle what was quickly being considered a Jewish problem. Each of these communal responses, with the exception of Cologne's, included evidence from their own interrogations with Jews that had resulted in confessions of well poisoning. First, many wells were filled in or had their bucket mechanisms destroyed so that people couldn't drink from them. This apparently was not enough, and even though the plague had not yet reached Strasbourg, on February 14th, 1349, all of the Jews of the community were rounded up and executed in a process that took almost a week. Let me back up for a second and repeat part of that sentence. The plague had not yet reached Strasbourg. the town was so far plague-free. What the stories its citizens had heard from other communities so terrified them that they were willing to do literally anything to spare themselves the fate so many others had met. And apparently, they thought if they killed the Jews in their community quickly enough, those people wouldn't have time to put their plan of well poisoning into action, and so the Christian community of Strasbourg would be saved. Many of the leaders of Strasbourg had previously sought to protect the Jews in their community. The mayor and several of the most prominent burghers of the town tried to enforce an order of protection for the Jewish population. These leaders came into conflict with some of the most powerful guild leaders of the community, in particular the Butchers' Guild. In the face of this opposition, most of the burghers gave up their leadership positions. For a time, the mayor, Peter Swarber, stood alone against them, but then he, too, was forced to resign his position. Almost immediately, a new council was selected, and the day after its members were sworn in, all the Jews in the community were rounded up and made ready for execution. Some other Christian leaders tried to protect the Jewish communities in their areas as well. For example, Duke Albrecht of Austria issued an order of protection when the pogroms started, but by 1349, the anti-Semitic hysteria had increased to such a degree that he withdrew his protection. One chronicler relates that some high-ranking citizens no longer wished to offer support to the Jewish community. Quote, but the imperial citizens did not want to go on supporting them, and so they wrote to Duke Albrecht of Austria, who was protecting his Jewish subjects in the counties of Fürth, Alsace, and Kinburg, and told him that either he had them burnt by his own judges, or they would burn them themselves. So the Duke ordered them to be burnt by his own judges, and they were finally burnt on 18 September. End quote. I know you've probably reached the limit of your ability to be horrified, but it gets worse. You recall that Cologne was one of the few towns that seemed to have any sense that these so-called confessions from interrogations of supposed Jewish well poisoners were nonsense, and Cologne held out for a long time as a place whose Jews were protected. While there certainly may have been some basic human decency at work here, there were also economic concerns in play, as the Jewish community of Cologne was a pillar of its economic structure. For many people, the desire to protect the Jews may have had more to do with maintaining a stable social and economic order rather than making a stand against injustice. Because Cologne had been one of the more reasonable communities, many Jews fled there in the face of persecution in their home cities and towns. This explosion in the Jewish population of Cologne finally began to worry that city's Christian citizens, the more paranoid of whom began to imagine that the Jews were gathering in a sizable force in that town, the better to take over and defeat the Christians there. Remember what I said a little earlier about conspiracy theories? The leaders of the Jewish community got wind of this growing dissatisfaction and began to take precautions, retreating within the ghetto and distributing weapons among the residents. These weapons were probably not the Jews' own weapons, but most likely collateral that Christian money borrowers had left to secure a loan. There was no way to say smoke them out because a fire set in the Jewish quarter would likely spread to the rest of the town, and the Jews showed no signs of leaving the ghetto. So a small group of Christians acted as spies, pretending that they were on the side of the Jews and wanted to join their resistance against the Christians of Cologne. Once inside, they learned that the Jews were planning a raid on a particular quarter of the city on a particular day, most likely because they were running out of supplies and not because they had any desire to conquer Cologne. They were in survival mode. But the spies alerted the leaders outside the ghetto, and when the Jewish contingent made their move, they found an army waiting for them. What happened next was a remarkable thing. A huge pitched battle in the middle of a major city. Although many Christians died, it was the Jews who sustained the largest losses, with some reports saying that 25,000 were killed in the fighting. While all these accounts are appalling, what is perhaps most moving are the eyewitness accounts from genuinely baffled and sometimes even admiring Christian observers as they watch the behavior of those being led to execution. The chronicles relate that while some Jews wept, others danced and sang, embracing their coming death with joy. One of the most touching passages comes from the Parisian chronicler Jean de Venette, who wrote, quote, "The insane constancy shown by them and their wives was amazing. When Jews were being burnt, mothers would throw their own children into the flames rather than risk them being baptized, and would then hurl themselves into the fire after them to burn with their husbands and children." The toll exacted on the medieval European Jewish world was the worst that it had ever been, or would be, until the Holocaust of the 20th century. It's estimated that in German-speaking countries alone, approximately 340 towns launched pogroms against their Jewish populations. Scholars estimate that by the time the dust had settled, 80 Jewish communities were wiped off the map completely. This doesn't even take into account the numerous anti-Semitic activities in France and Spain that we know were also happening. But once the first wave of plague receded, so too did the hysterical anti-Semitism. Many of the Jewish citizens who had fled the pogroms, heading to places like Vienna, were invited to resettle in their hometowns within a decade of the first wave of plague. By late 1350, several chroniclers and even Pope Clement VI himself started to voice the observation that the Jews seemed to be dying in numbers as great as Christians. And more to the point, the plague struck hardest in precisely those towns that had already expelled all their Jews as a preventive measure. Strasbourg murdered its Jews in February 1349. Just a few months later, in July of that same year, the plague struck there with great ferocity. All of this together took the power out of the idea that Jews were somehow responsible for the Black Death, and indeed on a few occasions during future outbreaks, Jewish and Christian leaders would join together to offer prayers for deliverance from the plague. Those few instances when this happened stand as moments of hope and positivity and cooperation in the midst of an otherwise grim landscape of death, disease, fear, and persecution. In the modern world, especially in the West, the phrase separation of church and state is familiar and understood by pretty much everyone. I'm going to oversimplify hundreds of years of legal and social theory and practice here and boil it down by saying that what most of us take this to mean is that the government does not espouse any one particular religious belief system when it makes laws and carries out the duties and tasks of overseeing a functioning society. Theoretically, people are free to practice any religion they choose, and they also have the right to be free from religion. Now, I say theoretically because we often see disputes in the legal system about what is allowed and what is not. Is it okay for a judge to have the 10 Commandments hanging on the wall in his courtroom? What about having a nativity scene on government property? If one person's freedom of religious expression starts shading into persecution of other groups for their religious beliefs, where do we draw the line and say, this has gone too far? This is one issue that the medieval world simply did not have to deal with in any serious way for the majority of the Middle Ages. Not only was there no separation of church and state, but there was also often no difference between the two. The Pope was a ruler, and the office of the papacy considered itself superior to all earthly rulers like kings. But kings considered themselves fit to rule by divine right, meaning that God had ordained and approved of them holding their position. The church was the biggest landholder in the medieval world. The great scholars in the medieval university system were also holders of ecclesiastical positions, you couldn't really become one unless you were also the other. And it usually worked the other way as well. You couldn't be the holder of an ecclesiastical office unless you had some education. The courts regularly used religion as a guide in rendering verdicts and assigning punishments, and the burgeoning merchant economy and banking systems of the High and Late Middle Ages were briefly flummoxed by the fact that charging interest on a loan was considered the sin of usury. They resolved this problem by restricting Jews to professions like money lending. It was okay to the medieval mind if Jews committed the sin of charging interest, because they were already big sinners anyway. In short, during this period, the church is everywhere. It is part of every element of the medieval infrastructure. It imbues and influences politics, economics, family relationships, scholarly study, friendships, social structures, military conflicts, territorial disputes. The list goes on and on. And as we've seen in several earlier lectures, when the plague struck the medieval world in late 1347, it was thus completely natural that people would turn to the church for guidance, answers, deliverance, and comfort. In general, the church sought to respond as effectively as possible, but in the face of such a pandemic with no known treatment or cure, that effectiveness was severely limited. Some might say it was non-existent. Indeed, many scholars argue that it was the church's inability to offer any remedy against the plague that led, eventually, to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Because remember, in the medieval world in the West, there's really no Catholic Church with a capital C. There is only the Church. I quite frequently encounter students who are stunned to discover that their particular brand of Protestantism did not come into existence 10 minutes after the crucifixion, and that, in fact, it was at least 1,500 years after Christ's death that Christian belief systems, like those of Luther and Calvin, developed out of and distinguished themselves from what we call Catholicism today. In this lecture, we'll look generally at how the Church as an institution responded to the Black Death. In the next lecture, we'll examine the other side of the coin, as it were, and see how popular religious belief manifested itself in forms of expression that were slightly outside official ecclesiastical channels. Now, as I'm sure you'll recall, one of the first places struck by plague was the port city of Messina on the island of Sicily. In 1347, several Genoese galleys traveling from Constantinople and the area around the Crimea put in at the port there, and shortly thereafter spread plague throughout the city. The people turned to their religious leaders for help, and those leaders attempted to oblige. The people of Messina appealed to the Patriarch of Catania that he bring the relics of Saint Agatha to their city in the hope that this would effect a miraculous cure. The Patriarch attempted to do all he could, but his efforts were useless. The plague raged on and eventually claimed him as one of its victims. This very early, highly visible failure of the Church to effect any sort of cure or relief for its flock would be replayed again and again throughout the medieval world. In our case study of Avignon, we saw how the Pope himself was advised to wait out the epidemic by staying inside, pacing back and forth between two raging fires that would supposedly purify the air, which was infected by miasma. If the Pope had to retreat and turn to such extremes to avoid contagion, what hope did the common man have? When the plague first erupted on the scene, the initial approach taken by church leaders was to use this horrible event as an opportunity to remind humanity of the grievous nature of their sins. Sermon after sermon described how God had sent the great pestilence to teach humankind a lesson. There was also an attempt to appease God. Pope Clement VI himself composed a special Mass in response to the outbreak of plague, in which he appealed to God for forgiveness and mercy. The Archbishop of York, William Zouche, also offered an official response to the plague. In a letter dated July 28, 1348, so right around the moment the plague first showed up in England, Zouche ordered that the parishes of England should have devout processions, quote, every Wednesday and Friday in our cathedral church, in other collegiate and conventual churches, and in every parish in our city and diocese. And a special prayer should be said in Mass every day for allaying the plague and the pestilence, and likewise prayers for the Lord King and for the good estate of the Church, the realm, and the whole people of England, so that the Savior, hearkening to the constant entreaties, will pardon and come to the rescue of the creation which God fashioned in his own image. End quote. King Edward III of England asked the Archbishop of Canterbury, John de Stratford, to arrange for prayers to be said against the plague throughout the parishes in the environs of Canterbury. Stratford unfortunately died of plague before he could comply. The responsibility was handed off to the prior of Christ Church in Canterbury, and he composed a letter to the Bishop of London in which he asked for help in conveying the royal request to other bishops in the realm. The letter is remarkable for many reasons, not the least of which is the lengthy discussion of the evils and sins that the people of England must have committed for God to rain down this affliction upon them. But toward the end, after the prior has used the stick of, we're all big sinners, so we'd better do something quick, he comes out with the carrot, quote, and so that those subject to you should be made the more eager to do these things, you should arrange to grant indulgences to every one of your flock undertaking the things specified above. You should also tell all the other bishops to add indulgences on their own account, as seems best to them. End quote. A quick word here on indulgences, and again, I'm oversimplifying. The idea here is that pretty much every soul will have to spend some time in purgatory after death before getting to go to heaven. This is because in order for a sin to be forgiven, the sinner had to have guilt or culpa, and there had to be a punishment of some duration, some penance that the sinner would have to do. This was the poena. So you could be forgiven for the culpa as long as you performed the correct poena, whether here on earth or later in purgatory. A standard example that you're probably familiar with from TV or movies is a priest giving someone a penance for a minor sin, something like, say 10 Hail Marys every morning for a week and fast for the next 2 Fridays. The priest has forgiven the guilt, and the sin can be wiped off the permanent record, so to speak, by the sinner performing the penance with true contrition. An indulgence, generally speaking, meant that the sinner could skip some or all of the penance part. Indulgences had first become a really key part of the Western Christian belief system during the Crusades, when the Church called on soldiers to retake the holy city of Jerusalem and surrounding regions, and offered the Crusaders full indulgences if they participated and died while on campaign. In other words, as bad as some of the Western warriors might have been in their lives, if they took up the cross and marched on the Holy Land, they got to go straight to heaven and skip purgatory altogether. But as we all know, none of these things had any effect on the Black Death. It wasn't too long before people had had enough. Every aspect of their lives was imbued with religion, and their daily existence was structured by church rituals and observances and the yearly rhythm of life moved in time with the liturgical calendar. So surely the Church could now offer some comfort. Could all of humanity be so bad as that? And why hadn't the Church offered more dire warnings about the state of humankind's sins? As Philip Ziegler puts it, quote, all that the Church had done was wait until it was too late, and then point out to their flock how wicked they had been, end quote. In the first wave of plague, we have evidence that any number of clergymen sought to do their best to comfort their dying parishioners. As you might guess, the outcome of this was that most of these good, sincere clergymen died. Those that remained alive sometimes abandoned their posts out of fear of contracting plague. The Bishop of Bath and Wells criticized priests for not being devoted enough to their duties, and an anonymous monk from Wells Cathedral observed that, quote, in this plague, many chaplains and hired parish priests would not serve without excessive pay, end quote. Another monk noted that, quote, parishes remained altogether unserved and beneficed parsons had turned away from the care of their benefices for fear of death, end quote. Since the plague seemed to affect the clergy in equal, if not greater numbers in the general population, the institution of the Church, just like every other organization, started to suffer from a serious shortage of manpower. This meant that suddenly, the life of cleric or monk or priest, a highly desirable, stable, secure life that most people had long considered an ideal option, but that had heretofore been available almost exclusively to members of the nobility. Well, now, this was open to almost everyone. Almost anyone could become a member of the clergy if he was alive and breathing. While this sudden fluidity and mobility was an unexpected boon for many individuals, it was not such a good thing for the Church. That institution had long had orderly ranks and standards and hierarchies along which one could progress by doing the expected things. One needed to study, to serve, to learn, and only the best of the best would end up being promoted from the ranks of a monk to a priest or abbot or bishop. But when plague rages through your monastery and overnight carries off 50% of your population, and we know that certain religious houses suffered a 90% loss, then you've got to get live bodies in the cassocks and up at the altar and leading the processions, and you don't have time for everyone to proceed through the ranks in an orderly fashion. In the immediate wake of the plague, all rules of religious ordination were more or less abandoned. England provides a clear example of this. In Winchester in 1349 and 1350, records tell us, 27 new members of the clergy were ordained subdeacons, then deacons, and then priests, all in the space of a few days, rather than the several years this advancement would normally have taken. They then got sent out to their parishes and church offices with almost zero experience. The Archbishop of York started holding emergency ordinations. Middle-aged men who had been widowed by the plague turned to the church and were accepted without hesitation. Well, this had certainly been an option before the Black Death. A man who had been married and lived an earthly life for decades would usually have started at the bottom rung of the ladder if he entered holy orders. Not now. The church was taking everyone it could, and the result was a flood of ill-qualified and unprepared priests who were supposed to minister to a flock that was in desperate need of informed and sincere religious guidance. Clearly, they weren't going to be getting it, and this caused the reputation of the church to fall still further in the eyes of the general population. Far from being experts on matters scriptural or religious, the new crop of priests were often illiterate, and they were poorly suited in terms of temperament for the job they were now supposed to do. It was not sincere belief or faith that had led most of them to seek out ordination, but rather the promise of a secure living, a roof over their head, and food on the table no matter how bad the harvest had been. For many who had been laborers before the Black Death struck, this life seemed greatly preferable to scratching out a subsistence living as a farmer. And yes, the church still needed these men, ill-suited as they were, because there was such a severe shortage of priests. Things got so bad that the Bishop of Bath and Wells issued the following statement in January 1349, quote, "The contagious pestilence of the present day, which is spreading far and wide, has left many parish churches without parson or priest. Since no priest can be found, many people are dying without the sacrament of penance. Persuade all men that if they are on the point of death, to make confession to each other, or even to a woman." End quote. Now, it had long been the case that in extreme circumstances, any baptized Christian could perform necessary rites. Midwives, in particular, very often had to perform the rite of baptism if they delivered a child who seemed likely to die before a priest could be summoned. But the fact that the bishop announced to his parishioners that they should go ahead and make confession to whomever happened to be present is a clear indication that things were really, really dire. While many of these ecclesiastical vacancies came about because a priest died, others existed because some higher-ranking priest had died, and a lower-ranking official saw the chance to jump up the ladder of clerical advancement. And because most ecclesiastical offices came with a stipend of some kind, and because there was a desperate need to fill them, many of the ordained started asking for their stipends to be increased. The Archbishop of Canterbury, seeking to curb this, issued an injunction against it. Right around the time the secular government in England passed the Statute of Laborers, which fixed wages for laborers at pre-plague levels and put restrictions on movement throughout the countryside. We'll talk more about that in the lecture on the economic effects of the Black Death, but we can see in the acts of Archbishop Simon Islip and later Archbishop Sudbury that every part of society is affected. Sudbury went so far as to say that the clergy were, quote, "so tainted with the vice of cupidity that they are not content with a reasonable stipends, but demand and receive excessive wages. These greedy and fastidious priests vomit from the excess of their salaries. They run wild and wallow, and some of them, after sating the gluttony of their bellies, break forth into a pit of evils." End quote. At the same time that established institutions like monasteries and the office of the parish priest were suffering, a relatively new arm of the church was gaining credibility and popularity. Although officially part of the church with a capital C, they operated somewhat outside its main conventions, and their actions during the Black Death would actually and ironically further erode the authority of the establishment they were supposedly a part of. These were the mendicant orders, and I'll need to pause here briefly and explain what the mendicants were and why their experience and reputation during the Black Death was so different from that of their monastic brethren in different orders. Okay, so once again, as you're probably tired of hearing me say, I'm super oversimplifying here in the interest of time, but here's the deal. For most of its history, the church's officials, especially monks, had to conform to certain rules of behavior. In addition to poverty, most monks and some other officials vowed to observe stability of place, meaning they were to stay in their monastery or secure in their parish offices. But then in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, a new reform monastic movement was given license. This was the Friars Minor, one of the first mendicant movements, as founded by St. Francis of Assisi. Francis had famously argued that to have a truly Christological experience, monks should rid themselves of all possessions and throw themselves on the mercy of the world, going about with only a staff and a bowl, wandering and preaching the word of God, traveling into various villages and towns that might not have the benefit of a parish priest to guide the flock, or might not have a very good one. Mendicant means begging, and when these orders were approved, there was much grumbling among those who thought that stable, established houses of God were the way to go. But the argument was that these monasteries had, maybe accidentally, become places of too much comfort and even luxury to produce and maintain truly holy men. The majority of monasteries were Benedictine, and many of them were near, or indeed right in, large towns and cities. They were thus part of the economic and social fabric of the town in which they were located, and they interacted regularly with people outside the monastery. Feeling that the Benedictines had become too worldly, the Cistercian order came into being at the end of the 11th century, with the goal of removing the monks and their monastery from the secular world as much as possible. Cistercian monasteries were deliberately built as far away from civilization as was possible. However, the Cistercians became victims of their own hard work, especially in raising sheep and participating in the wool trade, and they suddenly found themselves becoming quite wealthy and comfortable. This in turn led to yet another reform movement, which was the Friars Minor of St. Francis. And if you go to Assisi today and see the gorgeous Basilica of St. Francis there with its amazing frescoes, you'll see that they too ultimately failed in their attempt to espouse poverty and isolation. But the point to keep in mind for now is that you had these friars wandering the countryside, and in most instances, they really were what you might call super monks. In the beginning, at least, they didn't have a mother house they could return to. They were out in the world in a sincere attempt to save it. And when the Black Death started ravaging the countryside, a potential savior from outside looked like a very attractive option for those who were living in fear. Because what they've been seeing at home is their regular parish priest doing the things he'd always done and having no impact on the mortality that's carrying off half of pretty much everyone in the community. Or more likely, they'd watched their parish priest perform his duties faithfully and then contract the plague and die from it for his troubles. Or even worse, they'd seen him abandon his post, or refuse to perform his duties, or demand excessive payment for services. Or as some accounts record, the priest demonstrated real fear in the face of plague, hovering at the foot of an ill person's bed as he hastily performed last rites, touching the dying person as little as possible, and then rushing away as fast as he could. And in many instances, parishes were completely without a religious leader to guide the people left behind. And into this came the friar. It certainly would have been striking to a community when a devout, holy man wandered in from the outside and willingly took on the task of tending to the sick and bereft. While certainly the friars contracted and died from plague at the same rates as everyone else, the sincerity and devotion with which most of them approached the challenge at hand would have made a strong impression on those who would survive and later remember who it was that came to help in the darkest hour. As I said, while friars were officially part of the church, they were so different from what people were accustomed to that their presence and behavior surely seemed like a challenge to the long-standing practices of the institution they were a part of. It's no surprise that those who were members of the established ecclesiastical hierarchy saw the popularity of the mendicant orders as a threat. Indeed, many religious leaders signed and presented a petition to Pope Clement VI in Avignon. Remember, he is sitting between his two fires for most of the epidemic. And in this petition, They asked that he abolish the mendicant orders, or, at the very least, forbid them from preaching and hearing confession. This was in 1351, after the worst of the plague had made its way through most of Western Europe, and those who had survived were attempting to get back on their feet. The Pope's response was rather astonishing. He said, quote, "And if their preaching be stopped, about what can you preach to the people? If on humility, you yourselves are the proudest of the world, arrogant and given to pomp. If on poverty, you are the most grasping and the most covetous. If on chastity, but we will be silent on this, for God knoweth what each man does, and how many of you satisfy your lusts." End quote. Now you recall from our case study of Avignon that Pope Clement VI was by no means a model ecclesiastic. He enjoyed all the comforts that came with his high status and was generally willing to look the other way when it came to infractions of the chastity and poverty clauses of the standard monastic oath. One contemporary went so far as to note that Clement was much more likely to be remembered for his good taste in food and entertainment than for his holiness. So for him to excoriate the bishops and priests who were appealing to him to kick out the mendicants meant that the state of the church at this point must have been corrupt indeed. The Black Death dealt two serious blows to the institution of the church. First, it simply killed off a huge number of the educated, dedicated, and sincerely faithful members of its ranks. These people could not be replaced overnight. The second important point here, which is directly related to the first, is that in the face of their greatest need, the church could provide almost nothing in the way of comfort or assurances to its flock. The clergy's authority and status was severely undermined because its members were just as susceptible to plague as everyone else in society, and also because the representatives of God on earth seemed completely unable to persuade him to show mercy to those who were suffering so horribly. As Ziegler puts it, quote, "The church was a victim of the Black Death because of the legion of its most competent and dedicated officers who had perished, and still more, because of the honor and respect which it had forfeited in the minds of men." But even as the institution of the church suffered some serious setbacks during and after the outbreak of plague, the religious beliefs of the general population were stronger than ever. Even though the church itself couldn't provide answers or much comfort, people still thought that their faith could offer a means of deliverance from the great pestilence. When the Black Death raced through medieval Europe from 1347 to 1353, it was unlike anything the world had ever experienced. Everyone was caught flat-footed: governments, individuals, traders, merchants, and of course, as we saw in the last lecture, the church. Like almost every other institution, it was slow to react and ineffective when it finally did, and indeed, its inability to offer either countermeasures or comfort to those who were suffering dealt that institution a serious blow in terms of how people regarded it and whether they would continue to respect its authority. But just because people became disillusioned with the church with a capital C doesn't mean they lost their faith in general. Quite the contrary. For answers in the face of the greatest mortality the medieval world had ever seen, many people turned to faith. As people sought any solution possible to combat the ravages of the plague, there was an intensification or increase in many popular religious practices. For centuries, people had gone on pilgrimages to religious sites to seek atonement or healing, to give thanks, or simply to have a deeper religious experience than they might if they stayed at home. In the wake of the plague, however, pilgrimage numbers increased dramatically. The irony of this, of course, is that this meant that huge numbers of people were trekking hither and yon across the European continent and traveling long distances by boat, which of course only contributed to the spread of the very disease they wished to avoid. Several saints also received renewed attention and devotion, and a few were rescued from almost complete obscurity once someone made a connection between them and protection from illness. You recall from the last lecture that when plague struck the port city of Messina in Sicily, one of the first things the citizens did was appeal to the Patriarch of Catania, the highest-ranking ecclesiastical official in Sicily, to bring the relics of Saint Agatha that were kept in Catania to Messina in the hope that this would effect a miraculous cure. Here we see a perfect example of the struggle between the official church and popular religious belief. The Patriarch at first agreed to help those of his flock in Messina who were stricken with the great mortality, but the citizens of Catania reportedly rose up and protested vigorously, and in fact, physically prevented him from accessing Saint Agatha's relics, wresting the keys to the reliquary out of his hands, according to one chronicle account. Wanting to carry out his religious duties and protect both the citizens of Catania and those of Messina, the Patriarch came up with a compromise. He poured water over Agatha's relics, and then brought this now holy water to Messina. We know that no great miracle was effected. Indeed, the Patriarch himself was one of the victims of the plague, as were so many church officials. As we discussed last time, the fact that the great pestilence seemed not to spare the men of God increased the despair of the general population. When church officials began to refuse to perform their ecclesiastical duties out of fear of contracting the plague, the reputation of the church with a capital C was struck another blow. But what's so interesting is that even as it seems very clear that popular estimation of the church was at an all-time low, as you recall, even the Pope himself condemned other members of the ecclesiastical hierarchy for being far more interested in matters of the flesh than those of the spirit. Expressions of religious devotion increased down at the level of the man on the street. In Italy, for example, 50 more religious holidays were celebrated in the immediate aftermath of the first wave of plague, and these came about by popular acclamation rather than an official ecclesiastical pronouncement. Throughout the countryside of Western Europe, but most especially in England, there was a burst of construction in the form of chantry chapels. The impulse for building these seems to have been somewhat similar to that which compelled people in the Russian countryside to build votive churches in a single day. But the Western Europeans building chantry chapels didn't share the same desperate need for haste. A chantry chapel could be a structure that stood alone, or it could be a dedicated space within an established church or cathedral. Or it could be a small structure built so that it was attached to the larger church or cathedral. The purpose of these chapels was to serve as dedicated spaces where clergy would sing masses for the souls of the departed. Usually, it was the departed, in his or her will, or family members, who would endow the chapel with the specific stipulation that a certain number of masses or prayers would be sung there over a certain period of time, per week or per month or per year. The idea here was that pretty much everyone was a sinner to some degree or another, and thus everyone could expect that his or her soul would spend some time in purgatory before it got to move on to heaven. It was believed, and this belief was sanctioned by the church, that those still living on earth could help lessen the time a loved one's soul spent in purgatory by saying prayers themselves, or arranging for a priest to perform masses or say prayers on behalf of the departed. In order to guarantee this, of course, the chantry chapel needed to be endowed. That is, the departed or his or her family needed to arrange for payment for the priests or other clergymen's services in performing these masses. And if it sounds to you like this seems uncomfortably close to the wealthy being able to buy their way into heaven, well, welcome to the Reformation. This is exactly the kind of thing that bothered reformers like Martin Luther, who famously nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg in 1517. While the early 16th century may seem a long time removed from 1350 and the height of the Black Death, I would argue that the seeds of the Reformation were planted during this period. It just took them a while to grow and bear fruit. Philip Ziegler perhaps puts it best, quote, "The Black Death did not cause the Reformation. It did not stimulate doubts about the doctrine of transubstantiation. But did it not cause a state of mind in which doctrines were more easily doubted and in which the Reformation was more immediately possible?" End quote. When God's earthly representatives seemed both unwilling and unable to help those afflicted by plague, people turned to other intercessors for assistance. In particular, they began to pray to specific saints for special help against the plague. Some of these saints were considered intercessors or appropriate figures to pray to for help. The Virgin Mary had long been a popular saint for those concerned with matters of illness, as had her mother, Saint Anne. Saint Agatha is the patron saint of illnesses having to do with the breasts, but we can see how, when plague came to Messina and her relics were just a few miles away in Catania, the locals might have thought she was a logical saint to pray to for intercession in the face of an illness that, among other things, caused people to cough up blood. And that's kind of associated with the breasts, right? But in the face of the bubonic plague, more focused help was needed. Other saints were dusted off and brought front and center, and these included Saint Sebastian, Saint Roche, and Saint Rose of Viterbo, among many, many others. And when I say many, many others, I really mean it. By one count, there are over 100 saints who were specifically identified as interceding in matters of plague in the wake of the first wave of the Great Pestilence. Many of you have probably heard of Saint Sebastian, and even if you don't know his name, you might still recognize the standard iconographic way in which he is usually depicted. He's tied to a post or pillar with several, sometimes dozens of arrows piercing his body. Sebastian's story is quite typical of what we find among those martyred for Christianity in the early days of that religion. Sometime around the end of the 3rd century, Sebastian was a member of the Roman military. The empire at this time was still firmly pagan and polytheistic, and this new upstart Christian religion was considered dangerous and subversive. When Sebastian is discovered to be a Christian, he's imprisoned. While in prison, he manages to convert a bunch of other people to Christianity, and then, because he refuses to renounce his faith, he's executed by being tied to a post and shot full of arrows. You might ask, and rightly so, what does getting martyred by multiple arrow shots have to do with the great mortality? The connection is not at all obvious unless you know that the Roman god Mars is very often represented holding a bow, ready to shoot an arrow. And while those arrows were certainly instruments of war, they also could spread disease. And according to an earlier Christian chronicler named Paul the Deacon, it was the intercession of Saint Sebastian in the year 680 that caused the end of an epidemic that had been ravaging Rome. That wave of plague might have been a very late outbreak of the plague of Justinian, which, as you'll recall from some of our very early lectures, was the first known occurrence of a bubonic plague epidemic. So it makes sense then that people would appeal to Sebastian during the second and worst plague epidemic the world would ever see. Saint Roche, on the other hand, has a more direct connection to plague in his biography, although the details of his life have become so muddled that we've probably got a conflation of a couple of different religious figures happening here. The major points of Saint Roche's story go something like this. He was born into a noble family in Montpellier, France, near the end of the 13th century. His parents were very religious, and so was the young Roche, who supposedly went so far as to fast along with his mother while he was still an infant. That is, on days when she fasted in religious observance, he reportedly refused to breastfeed. When his parents died, Roche gave away all his possessions and set off for Rome. Upon his arrival there, he found a great illness ravaging the city. He immediately set about helping those who were ill, volunteering at various hospitals, and reportedly effecting miraculous cures by praying over many who were sick and near the point of death. Then he himself got sick, was kicked out of the city, and retreated to the woods, where he made himself a little hut and was befriended by a dog. The dog's master, a nobleman, became Saint Roche's acolyte. As is the case in so many saints' lives stories, he later dies in prison. Given that most of his story is about dealing with illness, Saint Roche makes a great deal of sense as a plague intercessor. He's not attested, however, until around 1391, and in those accounts we learn of a man named Roche who was very active during a confirmed outbreak of plague in Italy around 1376. This date would make much more sense, as whatever illness Roche encountered in the earlier version of the story in Rome in the 1320s couldn't have been bubonic plague, as it hadn't arrived on the scene yet. In any event, starting at the end of the 14th century, Roche becomes the go-to saint to pray to whenever plague shows up. Indeed, when plague broke out at the Council of Constance in 1414, the religious leaders in attendance prayed to Roche, and supposedly the outbreak ended. Now, Roche is very interesting because he's an example of how religious practices sometimes get put in place from the bottom up rather than the top down. In other words, Roche was venerated as a saint and prayed to for deliverance from the plague by thousands of people long before he was actually formally declared a saint by the institution of the church itself. People started venerating him in Italy and Germany shortly after the first waves of plague started sweeping across the continent, but he wasn't officially declared a saint until Pope Gregory XIV decreed him to be one around 1590, around 2 centuries after his veneration by what the church calls popular fervor began. Saint Roche was sometimes added to a roster of helper saints that came into being shortly after the Black Death swept through the Rhineland. Again, the grouping together of these popular intercessory saints into what eventually became known as the 14 Holy Helpers arose from general interest and acclaim. Or, it might be more accurate to say, from the desperation of the common people to find someone or something that might help them in their darkest hour. This was not a list of saints that the church had put together as part of some guide to what to do in case of the Black Death. These were figures that people in the general population had sort of settled on as the first line of divine intervention. Eventually, the church would officially recognize the 14 Holy Helpers, which included figures like Saints Barbara, Catherine of Alexandria, and Margaret of Antioch, who interceded in cases of fever, sudden death, and childbirth, among other things. Saints Christopher and Gilles were on the roster long before Roche got added, and they were specifically invoked as intercessors against plague. As we'll see in a later lecture on plague and the arts, the 14 Holy Helpers, and saints like Roche who got attached to their roster, became some of the most popular subjects in art, directly inspired by the events of the Black Death. Rose of Viterbo is another saint who was venerated for centuries before her official canonization. Rose was apparently a very pious child, and when she was just 7 years old, she began a life that would be marked by prayer, fasting, and long periods of seclusion. When she was 10, the Virgin Mary spoke to her and told her to join the religious order of Saint Francis of Assisi. One of the most important events of her life was when she sided with the Pope against the Emperor. She was born in Viterbo, which was later one of the Papal States, but during her lifetime, it was bitterly contested by the office of the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. For siding with the Pope, she and her family were expelled from their home, but eventually, the papal forces prevailed and she and her family returned. During her lifetime, she was respected not only for her pious religious devotion, but also for her ability to foretell the future, which she apparently did on a number of occasions, including one instance in which she accurately predicted the death of the Holy Roman Emperor. She herself died in 1251 or 1252, peacefully, in her father's home. What does Rose have to do with the plague? Well, nothing really, until a couple centuries later, when the people of Viterbo were facing something like their 10th outbreak of plague. The one that struck in 1450, a century after the first wave, was particularly bad. Their desperation was such that they started scouring the records of holy people who had been associated with the Viterbo at some point in the past. They found Rose, and many people began to pray to her for deliverance from the plague. Rose was canonized by the Church late in the 15th century, after numerous citizens of Viterbo attested that they or their family members were saved after praying to her. Again, we see here how popular belief can influence official institutions. Praying to holy men and women who would eventually become saints was hardly the only example of popular religious expression that erupted after the plague. Probably the most obvious example of a spontaneous, kind of grassroots religious response was that of the flagellant movement, which seemed to arise in several places across the continent, almost out of nowhere, and which we talked about at some length in an earlier lecture. When the flagellants first arrived on the scene, church officials were reluctant to say anything, one way or another. Indeed, in a world where extreme responses may be the only ones that work, people who willingly traveled from town to town, punishing their flesh with scourges and praying for humanity's sins in very public displays, were not the sort you wanted to castigate or disparage. At least, not at first. I've mentioned how early on, in Avignon, the Pope grudgingly allowed them to proceed through the town. But as their behavior became more extreme and branched out into truly weird activities like trying to bring a dead child back to life, and also preaching against church officials, ecclesiastical authorities moved to issue injunctions against their behavior, including a papal bull condemning flagellation as a response to the plague. Much more mainstream was the practice of pilgrimage, which had been widespread throughout the medieval world long before the plague appeared on the scene. Pilgrimages could be short or long. Pilgrims might travel to the next town over, where the church possessed, say, the toenail of this saint, or a stone that saint had once sat upon, or they might go long distances, like the pilgrims in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which we'll talk about in the lecture on literature and the plague. Those pilgrims travel 70-some miles from London to Canterbury to pray at the shrine where St. Thomas Becket's complete earthly remains were kept. Other pilgrimages were longer, to Santiago de Compostela on the Iberian Peninsula, to Rome, to Jerusalem itself, and to all manner of points in between. When plague arrived in the medieval world, most people thought there must be some divine element attached. God had sent it because of the sins of humanity, and maybe, by praying and living a holy enough life, one could avoid the Black Death altogether. This pilgrimage was a popular activity before the plague. Just imagine what it was like after the Black Death arrived on the scene. As you might expect, one popular destination for medieval pilgrims during the plague years was one of the shrines of Saint Sebastian himself. There were more than a few of these, because it was the common practice with saints' relics to divide them up. That way, more churches and cathedrals could benefit from the holiness of each saint. So, one church might have a saint's eyeball, while another might have her shin bone, or her cloak, or a cutting of the saint's hair. It was a special thing if the body of a saint was intact at one particular location. That church was lucky indeed. The presence or absence of these relics could mean stability or collapse for a church that did or did not possess them. Those who came on pilgrimage could be expected to make an offering of thanks, and those offerings would go straight into the church or monastery's coffers. The more A-list your saint was, the more likely you would get high pilgrim traffic, and the more likely it was that your ecclesiastical institution would get some financial benefit. In 1348, for example, the French abbot Gilles Le Moussis of Tournai, whom we've discussed in earlier lectures, noted that, quote, while the mortality was at its height, an enormous number of people, including those of noble birth, knights, matrons, ecclesiastics, canons, and members of religious orders, as well as ordinary men and women, flocked to the monastery of St. Peter at Hennegau, end quote. This happened after people discovered that the monastery reportedly held some relics of St. Sebastian. Another monastery, that of St. Médard at Soissons, also had some of Sebastian's relics. According to Gilles, there was a huge spike in the number of pilgrims traveling to that location as well. As most of you are probably thinking right now, the idea of large groups of people from all over the medieval world traveling through it and then gathering together in large groups is exactly the opposite of what people should do in the middle of a pandemic. It's a cruel irony that this attempt to avoid the plague probably infected more people with it, and probably brought it to places that had so far managed to avoid infection. You might be a healthy pilgrim on the way out, hoping that by going on pilgrimage now, while you and your community were still unscathed, God might show mercy and continue to keep the plague away. And while traveling the pilgrim road, or after you arrived at a shrine, you would most likely mingle with other pilgrims, some of whom were coming from plague-infested places, and many of whom carried plenty of fleas with them in their clothing. Also remember that along the way, you'd need a place to stay. You might stay in the guest chambers of a monastery, as did many others before your arrival. You might stay at an inn, where you most likely had to pay for part of a bed. That's right, it was perfectly typical, if you were a medieval traveler stopping for the night, to end up sharing a bed with a complete stranger. And that bed was probably made of straw or other plant material covered with linen that was almost certainly not washed with any kind of regularity. Even if you had a private room, it would have been slept in by any number of people from any number of places before your arrival. If you think the bedbug infestations that have plagued big hotels in recent years are horrifying, then you should definitely not consider time traveling back to the medieval world, if that option ever becomes available. At the same time that more people were hitting the road as pilgrims seeking salvation, other people recognized that this was not ideal, even if they didn't fully understand the theory of germ transmission. Those pilgrims who did make it home and shared their experience all talked of roadblocks put up by members of certain communities who really didn't want a steady stream of potentially infected people marching through their town. Thank you very much. They also talked of shuttered inns and establishments that were turning away strangers. And then there were the dead. Along the sides of the roads were those who had died while on pilgrimage or returning from it, either from plague or maybe another disease, or in some cases, natural causes like heart attack or stroke, and in still other cases, probably simple exhaustion. Apart from Jerusalem, the greatest pilgrimage you could make during the Middle Ages was to the holy city of Rome. At the end of the 13th century, Pope Boniface VIII had declared that the year 1300 would be a jubilee year. By that, he meant that all those who made a pilgrimage to Rome that year would receive full remission of all their sins as long as they were truly contrite and fulfilled his command to visit the basilicas of Saints Peter and Paul once a day for 15 days. If you were an inhabitant of Rome and didn't have the burden of traveling to the city, you could partake in the Jubilee as well, as long as you went to those basilicas once a day each for 30 days. Boniface had intended for Jubilees to happen once every century, but in 1349, several people appealed to Pope Clement, pointing out that this schedule would mean that many Christians would be deprived of the opportunity to experience a Jubilee due to the long period between them. Clement went ahead and called the Jubilee for 1350, and as you can imagine, those who had managed to survive the Black Death to this point, and those who managed to avoid it, felt a strong compulsion to travel to Rome, both to give thanks, and of course to get that ticket on the express train out of purgatory. Many people probably thought they were likely to die sooner rather than later, and wanted to get their spiritual affairs in order. In a world in which religion pervaded just about every aspect of life, it's hard to imagine that there would be those who didn't want to go. And as you might expect, given all that traveling from far-flung locations, the injunction to gather at specific places on specific consecutive days, while the plague had plenty of opportunity to find new hosts and achieve its last gasp of virulence before this first wave of the great mortality finally began to recede. In its wake, of course, lay a world that was utterly changed. One dramatic difference was the kind of artistic expression that we see throughout the medieval world. We'll explore how the Black Death affected the artistic sensibilities of various artisans and craftsmen and produced new trends in painting, sculpture, and more. As you are no doubt well aware by now, the arrival of the plague in the medieval world in late 1347 inspired a number of reactions. Fear, obviously, increased religiosity, despair, strange behavior like that exhibited by the flagellants, cruelty, anti-Semitism, and violence. Those reactions are the dark clouds that overshadowed the medieval world between 1347 and 1353. The silver lining came in the form of new and innovative forms of artistic expression. Here again, new subjects appearing in all kinds of painting, sculpture, wood carvings, and other art forms are evidence of an attempt to cope with a serious tragedy. As we'll see in this lecture, that beauty could emerge from such a horrific experience is one of the things that has long been a hallmark of what it means to be human. The desire to produce something positive out of horror is a reminder of how tough people can be. That knowledge is one of the great gifts that the Black Death has given to the ages, even in the midst of everything it took away. To be sure, many of the images are grim and negative, just as we'd expect, but the fact that they exist at all shows great human resilience. It would have been much easier to simply lay down the paintbrush, the chisel, or the pen, and just wait for the inevitable. Indeed, in the immediate wake of the plague, many brushes, chisels, and pens were laid down, never to be picked up again. That's because so many craftsmen and artisans died. Many of the people who produced art and architecture were gone. So many projects that we might think of as artistic were abandoned. For example, the great cathedral of Siena, Italy, initially completed in the 13th century, was intended to be significantly enlarged according to plans drawn up in 1339. Work was begun, but with the arrival of plague, it stopped completely in 1348. Those plans were never executed, and you can see the faint remains of what would have been in the parking lot that's adjacent to the cathedral today. But even as many artistic and architectural projects had to be abandoned in the wake of the plague, other works, particularly those that could be conceived of and executed by a single individual, came to be more popular, and several key themes became more pronounced and widespread in the art of the time. Most of these artistic themes had been in existence before the arrival of the plague, but in the aftermath of the first wave of the Great Mortality, certain of them became almost omnipresent, while other, less scrim or macabre artistic topoi languished because they didn't seem quite right for the new world that had come into existence. One very popular artistic trend was that of the three living meet the three dead. This was part of a larger memento mori tradition, which translates roughly to something like, remember that you are going to die. You could definitely say that by the end of the 14th century, pretty much everyone was well aware of this fact. Like most of the artistic trends during this period, this allegory as both text and image existed long before the plague appeared on the scene, but it gained in popularity as the Great Pestilence spread throughout the medieval world. In both the textual and visual versions of this story, three living men traveling on their way encounter three corpses. Sometimes the corpses are the ancestors of the men who are traveling. Sometimes the three people traveling are meant to be representatives of each of the three orders of medieval society, those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. Most often, however, the three living are from the nobility and the clergy. In several instances, we see a pope, an emperor, and a king depicted. In every case, though, the message is the same. You may be alive now, but someday you'll be dead like us. Indeed, because many of the representations of this trope are found in illuminated manuscripts, we often have both the image and the narrative to accompany it. We see this very thing in a manuscript from the 14th century, known as the Delisle Psalter. By the way, in case you were wondering, a psalter is a manuscript that's primarily a collection of psalms, although it might contain other devotionally oriented works. Although the Psalter is written in Latin, above the image of the three living meeting the three dead, the scribe has added some dialogue into vernacular to flesh out what's happening in this scene, pun intended. The living each utter one line. "Ich am afert," cries one, "I am afraid." The next one says, "Lo, what ich say," or "Lo, what do I see?" While the third states, "Methenka hit be devil astray," I think that it is three devils. The dead each respond with lines of their own. Ik was welfare, such shall fu be, for Godus love be or be may, or in modern English, I was welfare, thus shall you be, for the love of God, beware of me. Even more grim were the architectural and sculptural works known as trancy tombs. Once again, these had existed in some form prior to the mid-14th century, but became much more prevalent in the aftermath of the plague. Most of you have probably seen in person or in photographs tombs that depict their occupants in effigy on top of them. This was a long-standing burial tradition in the medieval world, especially among nobility and royalty, and the typical form these take is of a large raised sarcophagus with a statue of the person inside lying on top of it. These kinds of tombs even have a special name, gisant. The statue usually represents the deceased as both asleep and looking their finest, often wearing their armor or best garments, and maybe holding a sword, or, in the case of the tomb of Eleanor of Aquitaine, holding a book. A trancy tomb is similar to a standard gisant, with one very important exception. The effigy is not of the deceased represented as when they looked their best and were at their most powerful. No, in the case of the trancy tomb, what we get is an effigy of a decaying corpse. There are some early 14th century semi-trancy tombs in England. These predate the plague, and instead of a full statue above the sarcophagus, they're usually in the church itself, along the nave leading up to the altar in the floor. On the cover of these interior graves, one will often find an incised covering or slab with raised metalwork, the kind of thing people like to do rubbings of. And in a few of these, a skeleton is depicted. The idea that death is always coming, memento mori, was always a part of medieval life, but the trancy tombs took this to a new level. In the 2 centuries following the initial wave of plague, those who could afford it took care to arrange for large burial spaces to be elaborately decorated, and there was an explosion in requests for effigies to be included in the memorial. More than one scholar has commented that this can arguably be seen as a reaction to the necessity of mass graves during the worst of the plague. There was something so horrifying to the medieval mind about being lost to eternity in a plague pit with no marker to note your place or any living person to point out where your earthly remains are buried. The vogue in tombs with effigies may have been a direct reaction against that horrifying anonymity. One of the earliest and most striking examples that we know of is the tomb of the judge François de la Sarre, who died in 1363 in what is today Switzerland. The effigy of La Sarre is sculpted to show worms crawling out of the judge's arms and legs, with his face and genitals represented as being gnawed on by frogs and toads. We know that many chronicle and medical accounts mention worms as being part of the symptoms that accompany infection with plague. Medieval people had enough familiarity with death to have noticed that maggots usually appeared to feast on a rotting corpse, but they believed incorrectly that these worms were already inside the human body, and the infection was part of what caused them to emerge and go into a feeding frenzy. After La Sarre, we see the construction of many more trancy tombs throughout Europe. One version of the trancy tomb represented both the peaceful, sleeping effigy of the deceased and the rotting cadaver the deceased had become. These double-decker tombs were especially prevalent in England and tended to have a raised platform almost at eye level that held the more traditional effigy. Below the top bunk, as I like to think of it, would be the rotting corpse effigy, directly on top of the lid of the sarcophagus. Henry Chickley, the Archbishop of Canterbury, commissioned his own tomb in this double-decker style, and it was completed in 1425. Carved onto the platform of the tomb was the following inscription: "I was a pauper born, then to primate raised. Now I am cut down and ready to be food for worms. You will be like me after you die, all horrible dust, worms, vile flesh." The Archbishop didn't die until 1443, at which point he was interred in his trancy tomb. But think about that for a moment. For almost 20 years, the Archbishop must have seen his own tomb ready and waiting for him on what was most likely a daily basis. Talk about memento mori. The most famous depiction of the mass burials that seem to inspire this revolt in the form of elaborate grave structures comes from the 1350 manuscript of Gilles Le Musy, who was abbot at Tournai when the plague broke out. Gilles gives an account of how the plague came to the medieval world from the east, describes the horrors of the plague, including the conspiracy theory about the Jews poisoning wells, and reports on proclamations made by the city officials of Tournai. These include rules about the depth of graves and injunctions against piling bodies up on top of each other, among many other things. The image that accompanies Gilles' text is the only one we have that we can securely date to the first outbreak of plague. For an image that's so much about death, there's a lot of lively activity. We see a large group carrying corpses to the edge of a mass grave, where others are waiting to help lay the bodies in the earth. Behind and in front of them, there are more men who are digging still more pits for the bodies that are still to come. In addition to the increase in the number of trancy tombs, in the face of the great mortality, those who could took steps to ensure that they would be remembered, that they would leave some trace on the world. Black Death scholar Joseph Byrne observes that an examination of wills from before the plague shows people making charitable bequests here and there, and the terms of the bequests are rather general. After the first wave of plague, however, Byrne notes more and more people from further down the social ladder were making these bequests, and when they did, they were careful to stipulate things like, quote, "My family's crest should be carved above the door of the orphanage to which I'm leaving my money," end quote, or "This chapel to which I'm contributing funds for maintenance should have a bust of my head in the niche to the left," end quote. Byrne points to the example of the Dattini family of Florence. When Francesco Dattini's father died in 1348, he left a scattering of donations to various religious institutions per his will. But when Francesco made up his will, he took a completely different tack. He specified that an enormous sum should go in just one direction, to found an orphanage that would be named after him. When he died in 1410, his instructions were carried out, and his wife commissioned an artist to paint huge frescoes on the outside walls of their palazzo. These frescoes were all meant to represent Francesco performing numerous charitable activities. That she wanted these to adorn the outside of their grand home, where everyone passing by could see them, means that she really wanted everyone to remember her husband and their family. It's pretty much like renting a billboard by a freeway and putting up a photo of your husband working in a medical clinic with Doctors Without Borders, or standing next to the white rhino that he saved from poachers, or something similar. The takeaway here is basically this. Number one, in the wake of the plague, more people went and had wills drawn up because they saw death all around them. Number two, people gave to charity, probably at least in part because they hoped a good deed done on earth would help them get to heaven more quickly. And number 3, when they made these bequests, they wanted to ensure that their generosity was commemorated. Number 4, that commemoration usually took the form of some sort of work of art. Even people further down the social ladder than we might expect commissioned works of art, including architectural pieces and paintings. Among the unlikely commissioners of art post-plague, we find not only nobles, but also bakers, gardeners, blacksmiths, and many other trades and craftsmen. By far the most widespread and popular form of artistic expression to emerge from the ravages of the Black Death was the representation of what is known as the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. The earliest use of the term that we can find comes from a Frenchman named Jean Lefebvre, who used it in a poem he composed in 1376 as he himself was recovering from the plague. Like the other art forms we've discussed, this artistic theme probably existed before the arrival of the Black Death, but with the onslaught of plague, it became an increasingly popular subject for representation. In Danse Macabre paintings, drawings, and woodcuts, death, represented as a skeleton, is usually shown engaging in a very enthusiastic dance, sometimes with other skeletons. Most often, the skeleton or skeletons are shown holding hands with a long line of living people, dancing them away to their deaths, kind of like a much more upsetting version of the Pied Piper, although that story is pretty disturbing just as it is. The key point in all Danse Macabre representations is that every member of society is shown as participating in this dance. So for example, you'll often see a clergyman holding hands with a farmer who is holding the hand of a child who might be holding the hand of a king. Or sometimes the 3 orders of society are represented in descending order. So kings and popes are first, then the lower ranks of society, all the way down to the lowliest peasants. The message is pretty clear. Death is the great equalizer. This was a lesson that everyone had learned during that first wave of plague. Many of the Danse Macabre images have been lost down through the ages, but we know they existed because people mentioned them. At the cemetery of Les Innocents in Paris, for example, we know that there was a very influential depiction of the Danse Macabre in a mural on one of the walls of the cemetery, and it was accompanied by a Jean Lefebvre's poem on the subject, written on the wall right next to it. Les Innocents no longer exists, so this mural is lost to time. But judging from personal accounts from the period, it seems to have made a huge impression on all those who saw it. The bones from Les Innocents were later moved to the famous catacombs of Paris, above one of the entrances to which is a sign reading "Arrête, c'est ici l'Empire de la Mort," or in English, "Stop, here is the Empire of Death." Another version of the Danse Macabre was painted on a wall of a plague cemetery at Old St. Paul's Churchyard in London. The great English poet John Lydgate translated Lefebvre's poem from French into English, and this version appeared on the wall next to the fresco. Both the English painting and Lydgate's translation appeared to have become no more sometime around 1549 when the cloister was pulled down. But again, from contemporary accounts, we know that this image and text existed and made an impact on all those who saw them. The Danse Macabre was a popular subject not only in paintings and drawings, but also in dramatic performances. In these allegorical dramas that were often part of some sort of religious service, the figure of death would usually ask characters representing all levels of society, one by one, to dance with him. While the characters could not refuse, they were portrayed as having one choice to make: salvation or damnation. The message here is clear: repent now and clean up your life before death comes to take you. A variation on the theme of the Dance of Death was the Triumph of Death. In these representations, no one is dancing. Rather, death is depicted as a warrior who fights against the living. Quite often, the allegorical struggle between life and death is thus depicted as an actual war, with death and life standing against one another on the battlefield with swords drawn. We definitely see this theme come to prominence in the immediate aftermath of the first wave of the Black Death. And, as with so many other topoi, it appears first of all as a literary text. The great Petrarch, the first poet laureate since the days of the Roman Empire, had written a treatise in the 1340s on the triumph of fame. In 1348, with plague everywhere, he rewrote this work to be about the triumph of death, and it was his treatise in part that brought the theme to all the corners of the medieval world. This image was everywhere, in churches, in manuscripts, depicted on the walls of hospitals, not a very encouraging or a cheery sight for patients to see. And of course, it was prevalent in graveyards. In most of these depictions, death is a skeleton who triumphs over his prey by plunging a sword into them. A painting in Subiaco, Italy, depicts exactly this, and it's a terrifying image of a skeleton with a gruesome grimace and long flowing hair striking down an unsuspecting nobleman. Similar images appear in places as diverse as the famous Treobliche Air manuscript, commissioned by the Duc de Berry, in woodcuts in English chronicle accounts of the plague, and in a painting in Palermo, Italy, where death is depicted as riding a super scary skeletal horse as he strikes down the living left and right. While the Danse Macabre image was pervasive in medieval France, England, and Germany, the evidence suggests that the triumph of death theme in visual form was particularly popular in Italy. Not only is it the main subject of paintings in Subiaco and Palermo, but there are many others, including one in the Camposanto Monumentale in Pisa. In the 1360s, a painter named Francesco Traini completed a series of frescoes for the Campo, which include such cheery subjects as the Crucifixion, the Last Judgment, the Inferno, and Il Trionfo della Morte, the Triumph of Death. There is some scholarly debate about the date of these paintings, with some experts suggesting that they were completed before 1348 and the onslaught of plague. If they were completed before 1348, and some still hold to the 1360 date, then at the very least, it was an image that must have seemed very apt to those who were living through the Black Death. Scholar Barbara Tuchman, whose book on the Middle Ages, A Distant Mirror, was for many years considered a classic starting point for those wishing to study the medieval period, described the painting this way, quote, "A scroll warns that no shield of wisdom or riches, nobility or prowess can protect them from the blows of the approaching one. They have taken more pleasure in the world than in things of God. In a heap of corpses nearby lie crowned rulers, a pope in tiara, and night, tumbled together with the bodies of the poor, while angels and devils in the sky contend for the miniature naked figures that represent their souls." It is a truly horrifying image, but one that we cannot fully appreciate today because the fresco was badly damaged during Allied raids on Italy during World War II. And I'm sure there's some sort of lesson or irony in the fact that a medieval depiction of the triumph of death was partially destroyed in a modern war, but I'll leave that to you to figure out. One might argue that the triumph of death motif reaches its apogee in the painting of the same name by Peter Bruegel the Elder. His painting combines elements of the Danse Macabre tradition, which was called the Totentanz in Germany and the Netherlands, and the themes found in earlier triumph of death paintings. Completed around 1562, Bruegel's Triumph of Death is set in a landscape that includes a river, the sea, hills, a castle, and other geographical and architectural details. In other words, this background suggests the whole world. And that world is pretty bleak, full of smoke and fire, and it looks like we're viewing the aftermath of a great battle. It's also a painting with a cast of thousands. Pretty much every class, profession, rank, and occupation is represented here, and all of them are being carried off by skeletons. In fact, it is a veritable army of death that we see here. Even if you think you don't know this painting, I guarantee you that when you see it, it will seem familiar to you, as details from the painting and the whole of it have worked their way into popular culture. The Monty Python comedy troupe have acknowledged that the painting inspired parts of scenes in many of their movies, including Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Writer Don DeLillo referenced it in his novel Underworld, in which he imagines a scene where J. Edgar Hoover uses this painting to explain the potential threat of nuclear war. You can order a t-shirt with the painting on it from Amazon.com. It's even appeared on album covers like Black Sabbath's Greatest Hits. And of course, about half of the books written on the Black Death itself, it seems, have details from this work on the front or the back cover. These artistic representations were the outgrowth of an allegorical literary tradition, usually didactic poems, that were meant to remind people that death was inevitable and that they should be prepared to die. Just as the literary tradition evolved into a visual artistic tradition in the aftermath of the plague, so too did it evolve along another branch into something called the Ars Moriendi, or Art of Dying. This was a literary trend that became especially prominent in the 15th century, and it was based ultimately on two Latin texts from the period that offered Christians advice on how to live a good life, so that when it came time to die, they might have the best chance possible of going to heaven. These works were incredibly popular and translated from Latin into almost every vernacular language on the European continent. The long version of the text contains 6 sections. Section 1 admonishes the reader not to be afraid of death, or, as the band Blue Oyster Cult would say, don't fear the Reaper. The second section identifies temptations that a person on the point of dying must beware of, including despair, pride, impatience, avarice, and lack of faith. The third section lays out 7 questions that one should ask a dying person. The fourth is concerned with counseling people to try and imitate the example of Christ while still alive, while the fifth is concerned with practical matters of death and dying. Where should the family stand around the deathbed? What things should be said or not said? What sort of comforts should be offered? The text wraps up with a final section detailing the prayers that should be said on the occasion of a person's death. Many of these surviving texts are accompanied by woodcuts, some of which depict the personifications of the temptations, with the devil represented as encouraging these temptations. In a version of the text that dates from the Netherlands in the mid-15th century, these images of temptation are paired with others that illustrate how one should counter the devil's attempts to lure one into sin, and thus hell, on the eve of one's death. Perhaps the most famous of these woodcut images were done by the artist known as Hans Holbein the Younger to accompany a printed edition of the text that first appeared in 1524. In this version, the skeletons are not exactly dancing, but they do lead several victims from various classes away to their deaths. While the Ars Moriendi texts show in both word and image the particular and specific concerns vis-a-vis dying that came into popular fashion in the aftermath of the Black Death, several other literary texts took the Black Death itself as their inspiration. We'll turn our attention from the visual representations we've just discussed and focus more on the works that great writers like Boccaccio and Chaucer composed in response to the great mortality